Welcome, gentle dreamer, to a tale of courage born from suffering and kindness forged in darkness. Tonight, we follow the extraordinary life of Remus John Lupin, a man whose gentle heart carried the burden of a terrible curse, whose quiet strength touched countless lives, and whose greatest battles were fought not against external enemies, but against the monster within himself. As you settle into your cozy sanctuary, let these words carry you through the bittersweet chronicle of perhaps the kindest soul to ever walk the halls of Hogwarts. Close your eyes and drift into this story of love, loss, and the transformative power of acceptance. Welcome, gentle dreamer, to a tale of courage born from suffering and kindness forged in darkness. Tonight, we follow the extraordinary life of Remus John Lupin, a man whose gentle heart carried the burden of a terrible curse, whose quiet strength touched countless lives, and whose greatest battles were fought not against external enemies, but against the monster within himself. As you settle into your cozy sanctuary, let these words carry you through the bittersweet chronicle of perhaps the kindest soul to ever walk the halls of Hogwarts. Close your eyes and drift into this story of love, loss, and the transformative power of acceptance. In the rolling hills of Wales, where ancient magic flows through stone and stream like whispered secrets from forgotten ages, there lived a man whose passion for the mysterious had made him one of the wizarding world's most respected scholars. Lupin was not a man given to grand gestures or theatrical displays of power, but rather one whose quiet brilliance illuminated the darkest corners of magical knowledge. His specialty lay in the study of non-beings, those peculiar spirits and apparitions that existed in the liminal spaces between life and death, reality and nightmare. By the time he had reached his 30th year, Lyle had become the world's foremost authority on non-human spiritus apparitions, creatures that defied easy classification, even within the already bewildering taxonomy of magical beings. Poltergeists with their chaotic energy, boggarts that fed on fear itself, and other strange entities that had never truly lived, yet possessed a form of consciousness that challenged every assumption about the nature of existence itself. These were the subjects that consumed his days and haunted his dreams, filling his modest study with books whose pages rustled with their own malevolent whispers. His colleagues at the ministry often wondered how someone so gentle and soft-spoken could spend his life studying creatures born from humanity's darkest emotions. But Lyle understood something that eluded more conventional minds. To truly combat the darkness, one had to understand it completely, to map its territories and learn its languages until no shadow could hide secrets from your searching gaze. Knowledge, he believed, was the most powerful weapon against the forces that sought to exploit ignorance and fear. The cottage where he lived was a testament to his dedication. Its rooms lined with carefully catalogued specimens in magical containment units, each one labeled with meticulous detail about its origins and behavioral patterns. Visitors found the atmosphere unsettling, as if the very air carried whispers of things that should not exist. But Lyle moved through this collection of nightmares with the serene confidence of someone who had long since mastered his fear and transformed it into scholarly curiosity. It was his expertise in these matters that led him on that fateful autumn day to venture into the dense Welsh forests. Following reports of a particularly vicious boggart that had been terrorizing a remote village, the local authorities had proven useless, their conventional approaches only serving to agitate the creature further, and desperate appeals had finally reached the ministry's Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. Lyle packed his specialized equipment with characteristic thoroughness, understanding that boggarts were unpredictable creatures whose ability to manifest fears made them uniquely dangerous to the unprepared mind. The forest itself seemed to breathe with ancient malevolence, as he made his way along paths that deer had abandoned and birds refused to follow. Centuries of accumulated shadow had created an environment where even the strongest magical protections felt fragile, where every rustling leaf might herald the approach of something that fed on terror and grew stronger with each frightened heartbeat. But Lyle pressed forward with the determined patience of someone whose life's work had prepared him for exactly such encounters. It was in a clearing where the trees formed a perfect circle, as if nature herself had created an arena for supernatural confrontations, that he first heard the scream. The sound cut through the forest's oppressive silence like a blade, carrying notes of pure terror that spoke of a human soul confronted with its deepest nightmare made manifest. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to protect himself from whatever horror was unfolding in that cursed place. But his conscience would not permit such cowardice when someone clearly needed help. Racing through the undergrowth with a speed that his scholarly appearance wouldn't have suggested possible, Lyle burst into another clearing to find a scene that would change the entire course of his life. A young woman stood frozen in absolute terror, her face pale as moonlight, her eyes fixed on something that loomed before her with malevolent intent. The boggart had taken the form of a massive, brutish man whose features were twisted with sadistic pleasure, his hands reaching toward her with fingers like gnarled branches, his mouth open in a snarl that promised unspeakable violence. But it was not the boggart that stopped Lyle's heart. It was the woman herself. Even in her terror, even with her dark hair disheveled and her simple dress torn from her desperate flight through the forest, she was the most beautiful creature he had ever beheld. Her beauty was not the artificial perfection that could be achieved through magical enhancement, but something deeper and more luminous, as if her very soul cast light into the darkness that surrounded her. Hope Hal was her name, though he would not learn it until later, and she was a muggle whose imaginative nature had made her sensitive to the magical emanations that ordinary non-magical people could not perceive. Her regular walks through these woods had been her refuge from a world that often seemed too harsh and practical for someone whose heart was filled with poetry and wonder. But today her sensitivity had betrayed her, allowing her to sense the boggart's presence and thereby become its target. The creature fed on her fear, growing larger and more substantial with each terrified breath she took, its borrowed form becoming more detailed and threatening as her imagination supplied the horrors that it embodied. This was how boggarts operated. They were mirrors of darkness, reflecting and amplifying the fears that lived within their victims' hearts, until those fears became seemingly real enough to destroy the mind that had created them. Lyle's response was immediate and precise, his wand already moving in the complex pattern required for the boggart banishing charm before his conscious mind had fully processed the situation. The incantation rolled from his lips with the authority of years of study and practice, and the creature's borrowed form immediately began to waver and shrink, its power broken by his understanding of its true nature. Within moments, it had collapsed into its natural state, a small, innocuous mushroom that posed no threat to anyone with the knowledge to recognize it for what it truly was. Hope's relief was so profound that she nearly collapsed, her legs trembling with the aftershocks of terror that had coursed through her system. But as she looked at the man who had saved her, confusion replaced fear in her expressive eyes. She had seen the massive attacker simply vanish, had witnessed what appeared to be magic performed with casual expertise, and her practical mind struggled to process experiences that challenged everything she believed about the nature of reality itself. With characteristic wisdom, Lyle recognized the delicate nature of the situation. Here was a muggle who had witnessed magic, whose memory should by all rights be modified to protect the secrecy that kept their two worlds safely separate. But looking into her eyes, seeing the intelligence and wonder that shone there even in the aftermath of terror, he found himself reluctant to steal this moment from her memory, reluctant to reduce their meeting to some mundane encounter that would leave no trace in her heart. Instead, he chose a middle path, one that honored both his duty to magical secrecy and his growing fascination with this remarkable woman. He spoke gently, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had banished the boggart, explaining that the man who had threatened her had been startled away by his arrival. He agreed that the attacker had indeed been very large and very frightening, and that the only sensible course of action was for him to escort her safely home to ensure that no further danger could find her. The walk through the forest that followed was unlike anything either of them had ever experienced. Hope found herself drawn to this quiet, scholarly man, whose presence seemed to create a bubble of safety around them both, whose knowledge of woodland paths suggested a deep connection to the natural world that matched her own love of wild places. Lyle, for his part, discovered that her conversation was as beautiful as her appearance, filled with observations about literature and nature that revealed a mind both sensitive and sharp, capable of seeing beauty and meaning in things that others overlooked. By the time they reached the edge of the village where Hope lived with her aging parents, both knew that something profound had occurred between them, something that transcended the simple gratitude of rescued and rescuer. The connection they felt was immediate and powerful, as if they had been searching for each other without knowing it, as if the boggart's malevolence had somehow served a greater purpose by bringing them together in that enchanted clearing. Their courtship unfolded with the gentle inevitability of sunrise, each meeting deepening their understanding and appreciation of one another. Lyle found himself making frequent trips to that particular village, always with scholarly pretexts that grew increasingly transparent as time passed. Hope began taking walks at times, and in directions that seemed calculated to encounter the mysterious gentleman whose knowledge of folklore and natural history perfectly complemented her own romantic sensibilities. The moment of truth came several months later, when Lial could no longer bear the deception that lay at the heart of their relationship. The love he felt for Hope had grown beyond anything he had imagined possible, but it was built on a foundation of concealed truth that made every shared moment feel both precious and precarious. With characteristic honesty, he chose to reveal his true nature, understanding that their future together depended on complete trust and acceptance. The revelation took place in the very clearing where they had first met, under circumstances that he carefully controlled to minimize the shock of discovery. He demonstrated simple magic first, conjuring flowers that bloomed in her hands, creating lights that danced around them like captured stars, showing her wonders that made her gasp with delight rather than fear. Only when she was ready did he explain the truth about boggarts and the magical world that existed alongside her own, hidden but ever-present, filled with creatures and people whose existence she had sensed but never fully understood. Hope's reaction exceeded his most optimistic hopes. Rather than fear or rejection, she felt a deep sense of validation, understanding finally that her sensitivity to unseen presences and her feeling that the world held more mysteries than most people acknowledged had been rooted in truth. The magical world he described felt like coming home to a place she had always known existed but had never been able to find. And the fact that he trusted her with such momentous secrets only deepened her love for his gentle, honest heart. Their engagement was celebrated in the small village church where Hope had worshipped since childhood, though the wedding itself was conducted according to wizarding traditions that incorporated her Muggle heritage in ways that honored both worlds. The ceremony took place in a grove of ancient oak trees whose magic was old enough to welcome both magical and non-magical participants, creating a sacred space where their two worlds could meet. and merge in celebration of their union. The cake at their wedding reception bore a small sugar sculpture of a mushroom on its topmost tier, Hope's whimsical tribute to the boggart, whose malevolence had inadvertently brought them together. The guests who understood the reference smiled at her humor, while those who didn't simply admired the delicate artistry of the decoration, never knowing that they were looking at a symbol of how love could transform even the most frightening encounters into something beautiful. Their first year of marriage was a golden time filled with the joy of discovery and mutual devotion. Hope threw herself into learning about the magical world with the same passion she had once reserved for poetry and literature, finding that reality was far more wonderful than any fantasy she had imagined. Lial, meanwhile, discovered that sharing his knowledge with someone who approached it with such wonder and enthusiasm made even his most esoteric research feel fresh and exciting again. The cottage they shared became a perfect blend of both their worlds. Its rooms filled with magical texts and Muggle literature in equal measure, its gardens tended with both practical gardening skills and gentle enhancement charms that helped the flowers bloom more beautifully than nature alone could achieve. Visitors found it a place of warmth and welcome, where the boundaries between magical and mundane seemed less important than the love that had created such a harmonious sanctuary. It was in this atmosphere of perfect contentment that they began to hope for a child. Dreams that were fulfilled with surprising swiftness when Hope discovered she was carrying their first baby. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, marked by the quiet joy of two people who had found everything they had ever wanted and were now blessed with the promise of sharing it with a new life that would be the product of their love. On March 10th, 1960, in the front bedroom of their Welsh cottage while snow fell gently outside the diamond-paned windows, Hope gave birth to their son. Remus John Lupin entered the world with a cry that spoke of strength and vitality, his tiny fists waving as if he were already eager to embrace everything life had to offer. His parents looked down at him with wonder and gratitude, seeing in his perfect features a miracle that surpassed any magic they had ever witnessed. The baby showed early signs of magical ability, delighting his parents with small displays of accidental magic that were both charming and promising. Toys would float gently around his crib when he was happy, his baby blanket would warm itself when he grew cold, and his laughter had a quality that made flowers bloom more brightly in the garden outside his window. Lyle and Hope watched these developments with the proud satisfaction of parents whose child was clearly destined for great things. They imagined a future filled with possibility. Remus would attend Hogwarts when he came of age, would excel in his studies as his father had, would perhaps follow in Lyle's footsteps as a scholar, or strike out on his own path to make unique contributions to the wizarding world. The boy would bridge both worlds as his parents had, carrying forward their legacy of love and understanding between magical and non-magical peoples. But even as they planned and dreamed, the world beyond their cottage was growing darker with each passing month. Lord Voldemort's first rise to power was gaining momentum, though few yet understood the scope of the threat he represented. The attacks on Muggle families that would later be recognized as part of his campaign of terror were still being dismissed as isolated incidents, while the recruitment of dark creatures to his cause was only beginning to be noticed by those whose work brought them into contact with the magical world's more dangerous inhabitants. The signs were there for those who knew how to read them: an increase in creature attacks, reports of magical disturbances in areas that had long been peaceful, whispers of a powerful dark wizard gathering followers who shared his belief in magical supremacy. But the Ministry of Magic, like all bureaucratic institutions, was slow to recognize threats that didn't fit established patterns, slower still, to take action that might disrupt the comfortable status quo that had persisted since Grindelwald's defeat. It was only when the attacks became too frequent and too coordinated to ignore that the ministry began reaching out to experts who might help them understand what they were facing. Lyle's expertise in dark creatures made him an obvious candidate for consultation, and the letter requesting his assistance arrived on a morning when baby Remus was napping peacefully in his crib, unaware that his father's knowledge would soon place their family in the path of dangers they could never have imagined. The Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures was housed in the basement levels of the ministry, its offices cramped and poorly lit, reflecting the low priority that creature-related issues typically received from the wizarding government. But as Lyle made his way through corridors that bustled with unusual activity, he could sense the fear and uncertainty that had begun to permeate even these mundane, bureaucratic spaces. His new colleagues were a mixture of types. Some were dedicated public servants, genuinely committed to protecting both magical and non-magical communities from dangerous creatures, while others were political appointees more concerned with advancing their careers than addressing the growing crisis. All of them, however, shared a growing awareness that they were facing something unprecedented, something that required expertise beyond the conventional approaches that had served the ministry adequately in more peaceful times. The work was challenging and often disturbing, requiring him to analyze attack patterns and creature behavior that spoke of a coordinating intelligence behind what had initially appeared to be random violence. Each case file told a story of terror and loss, of families destroyed and communities left traumatized by encounters with creatures that had been turned into weapons of psychological warfare. But it was important work that could save lives and protect the innocent from forces they couldn't understand or defend against. Lyle threw himself into his duties with characteristic dedication, understanding that his comfortable life with Hope and Remus was only possible because people were willing to stand between civilization and the chaos that constantly threatened to overwhelm it. He had no way of knowing, as he worked late into the nights analyzing reports and developing countermeasures, that his dedication to protecting others would soon make him the target of the very evil he fought against, that his words spoken in righteous anger would return to destroy everything he held dear, transforming his greatest joy into his deepest sorrow. The cottage remained a sanctuary of peace and love, where Hope tended their garden and cared for little Remus, while his father worked to make the world safer for families like theirs. The baby grew and thrived, his laughter filling rooms that would later echo with very different sounds. His innocent joy, a light that would soon be shadowed by darkness beyond his parents' power to prevent. The morning that would shatter the Lupin family's peaceful existence began like any other, with sunlight streaming through the cottage windows and the gentle sounds of domestic harmony that had become the rhythm of their days. Hope was in the kitchen preparing breakfast while 4-year-old Remus played with his magical toys in the sitting room, his delighted laughter punctuating the quiet conversations between his parents about ordinary things, the garden that needed tending, letters from distant relatives, plans for the coming week that stretched ahead with comfortable predictability. Lyle had grown accustomed to the routine of his work at the ministry, where each day brought new challenges but also the satisfaction of contributing to something larger than himself. The Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures had become his second home, its cramped offices and overworked staff united by a common purpose that transcended the bureaucratic frustrations that plagued other government departments. He took pride in his reputation as someone who could unravel the mysteries that baffled less experienced investigators, who could see patterns in creature behavior that others missed entirely. The summons that arrived that grey October morning was routine in its wording, but urgent in its implications. 3 Muggle children had been found dead in the Yorkshire countryside, their bodies bearing marks that suggested creature attack, but displaying none of the usual signs that experienced investigators expected to find at such scenes. The local authorities were baffled, The magical investigators were stumped, and the case had been elevated to senior staff members, whose expertise might shed light on what appeared to be an unprecedented form of violence. Lyle arrived at the ministry to find the questioning committee already assembled in one of the department's larger conference rooms, its walls lined with charts depicting various magical creatures and their identifying characteristics. The atmosphere was tense with the particular strain that came from dealing with crimes against children, crimes that violated every civilized instinct and demanded justice that seemed impossible to achieve when the perpetrator remained unknown and unidentified. The suspect who had been brought in for questioning appeared, at first glance, to be everything his questioners expected from someone who might have information about such terrible crimes. Fenrir Greyback, though his name was not yet known to the committee, presented himself as a confused and frightened muggle who had somehow found himself in a room full of wizards, discussing horrors that he claimed to understand no better than anyone else. His appearance supported his story perfectly. His clothes were the rough, patched garments of someone who lived on society's margins, dirty and worn in ways that spoke of genuine poverty rather than theatrical disguise. He carried no wand, showed no signs of magical education or ability, and his reactions to the magical paraphernalia around him seemed genuinely bewildered. When questioned about his whereabouts during the attacks, he provided answers that were vague but plausible, the kind of imprecise recollections that characterize people whose lives lacked the structure that made detailed timekeeping possible. Most convincingly, his horror at the descriptions of what had been done to the children appeared absolutely genuine. His face paled at the more graphic details. His hands trembled when shown photographs of the crime scenes, and his voice broke with what seemed like authentic emotion when he spoke of the poor innocent victims whose deaths had brought him into this strange situation. He was, by every measure the committee possessed, exactly what he claimed to be: an unfortunate muggle who had been caught up in events beyond his understanding or control. But Lyle Lupin had spent years learning to see beyond surface appearances, to recognize the subtle signs that revealed truth beneath carefully constructed deceptions. His expertise in studying creatures that were masters of disguise and misdirection had taught him to look for details that others might overlook, to trust instincts that had been honed through countless encounters with beings whose survival depended on their ability to fool human observers. Something about Greyback troubled him from the moment the man entered the room. It was not any single detail, but rather an accumulation of small observations that created a growing sense of wrongness. The way Greyback's eyes moved around the room spoke of assessment rather than confusion, cataloguing exits and potential weapons with the unconscious precision of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. His posture, despite appearing relaxed, was actually coiled with tension, ready for explosive action if circumstances required it. More tellingly, there were physical characteristics that Greyback could not entirely disguise, no matter how convincing his performance might be. His fingernails, though dirty and broken, showed the yellowish tinge and unusual thickness that marked those who regularly transformed into creatures with claws. His teeth, visible when he spoke or smiled, were slightly too sharp and too numerous for purely human dentition. Most significantly, his scent carried undertones that Leo's trained senses recognized as distinctly lupine, the wild musk that no amount of bathing could entirely eliminate from someone whose monthly transformations left permanent traces on their physical form. As the questioning continued and Greyback's performance grew more convincing to the other committee members, Lyle's certainty grew that they were being masterfully deceived by someone whose very presence in their midst represented a threat beyond their imagination. This was no confused muggle, but a predator who had walked voluntarily into their stronghold, confident in his ability to manipulate their assumptions and escape with valuable intelligence about ministry procedures and capabilities. When Lyle finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute conviction despite the skeptical looks his colleagues directed toward him. He identified the signs he had observed, explained their significance in terms that should have been immediately recognizable to anyone with proper training in creature identification, and recommended that Greyback be held in secure detention until the next full moon, when his true nature would become undeniably apparent. The response from his fellow committee members was immediate and dismissive. They had already decided that Greyback was harmless, their judgment influenced by his convincing performance, and their own desire to believe that such a simple explanation could account for the terrible crimes they were investigating. Lyle's reputation for paranoid thoroughness, which had served him well in other contexts, now worked against him, as his colleagues assumed he was seeing threats where none existed, projecting supernatural dangers onto what was obviously a mundane situation. Their laughter stung more than he had expected, carrying undertones of professional dismissal that suggested his expertise was less valuable than he had believed. When they told him to stick to Welsh boggarts, since that was apparently all he was qualified to handle, the insult cut deeply into pride that had been built through years of dedicated service and successful investigations. They were reducing his life's work to a provincial specialty, dismissing his contributions as irrelevant to the serious business of real criminal investigation. The anger that rose in Lyle was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a white-hot rage that overwhelmed his usual calm demeanor and replaced his careful, scholarly precision with passionate outrage. These people were fools who would rather believe comfortable lies than face uncomfortable truths. Bureaucrats whose incompetence would cost innocent lives, while they congratulated themselves on their reasonable skepticism. In that moment of fury, with his professional reputation under attack and his warnings being ignored by people whose stupidity might prove fatal, Lyle spoke words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His description of werewolves as soulless, evil creatures deserving nothing but death was delivered with the full force of his scholarly authority, each word chosen for maximum impact on colleagues who had dared to question his expertise. He meant every syllable in that moment, his anger transforming years of academic study into personal hatred for creatures whose very existence represented a threat to everything civilized society held dear. Werewolves were monsters in human form, abominations that combined the worst aspects of man and beast into something that could never be trusted or redeemed. They deserved no mercy, no understanding, no consideration beyond the swift application of lethal force that would remove their threat from the world permanently. The committee's response to his outburst was swift and decisive. Such emotional language had no place in professional discussions. Such obvious bias rendered his judgment unreliable, and his continued presence would only disrupt the calm deliberation that serious investigations required. He was ordered from the room with the kind of bureaucratic finality that brooked no argument, his expertise dismissed, and his warnings ignored by people who believed themselves wiser than someone whose life had been devoted to understanding exactly such threats. As Lyle was escorted from the building, the committee returned to their business with the self-satisfied air of people who had handled a difficult situation with appropriate firmness. They apologized to Greyback for the unfortunate interruption, assured him that such unprofessional behavior was not typical of ministry operations, and prepared to release him with the kind of memory modification that would ensure his strange experience left no lasting impression on his obviously innocent mind. But the wizard assigned to perform the memory charm never got the chance to cast it. As they approached the ministry's public entrance, Greyback's two accomplices emerged from concealment with the coordinated precision that spoke of military planning and extensive rehearsal. The attack was over in seconds, leaving one ministry employee unconscious and 3 werewolves free to disappear into London's sprawling complexity with intelligence about ministry procedures and a burning desire for revenge against the man whose words had revealed such passionate hatred for their kind. Greyback had heard every word of Lyle's tirade, had absorbed every insult, and filed away every indication of the contempt that respectable wizarding society held for creatures like himself. The description of werewolves as soulless and evil had struck him not as hurtful condemnation, but as fascinating insight into the mind of someone whose comfortable prejudices had never been challenged by reality. Here was a man who had built his career on studying creatures from a safe distance, who thought he understood monsters without ever having to face the consequences of that understanding. The revenge that Greyback planned would be perfectly calibrated to destroy everything that Lyle Lupin valued most, while teaching him truths about the nature of evil that no amount of scholarly study could have conveyed. It would not be swift or clean, but slow and exquisite, designed to extract maximum suffering while leaving the victim alive to experience every moment of his transformation, from comfortable academic to desperate father of the very type of creature he had so eloquently condemned. The werewolves' escape from the ministry went unnoticed for several hours, their absence discovered only when a routine security check revealed the unconscious wizard and signs of struggle that should have triggered immediate alarms. By then, Greyback and his companions had already begun their surveillance of the Lupin cottage, studying its defenses and routines with the patient thoroughness of predators who understood that the best hunts required careful preparation. For weeks, they watched and waited, learning the patterns that governed the family's daily life. They observed Lyle's departures for work each morning and his returns each evening, noted Hope's trips to the village for shopping and social visits, catalogued the times when little Remus played in the garden under his mother's watchful eye. They studied the cottage's magical defenses, identifying weaknesses that could be exploited and escape routes that would allow them to vanish before any response could be organized. Most importantly, they waited for the perfect moment, a time when Lyle would be present to witness what was about to unfold, but powerless to prevent it, when the family would be gathered together in their sanctuary of love and safety, completely unprepared for the violence that was about to shatter their peaceful existence forever. The night before Remus Lupin's 5th birthday arrived with the cruel irony that seemed to govern all the worst moments in human history. The cottage was filled with excitement and anticipation as Hope prepared decorations for the next day's celebration, while Lyle helped his son practice blowing out candles on a practice cake that had been lovingly baked for the Immerse occasion. They spoke of the presents that waited wrapped in bright paper, of the friends who would come to share in their joy, of the milestone that marked another year of their boy's happy, healthy growth. Remus fell asleep that night, surrounded by the love of parents who believed they could protect him from anything the world might threaten, his dreams filled with birthday wishes and childhood fantasies that had no room for the nightmare that was already creeping through their garden. Hope and Lyle spent the evening in quiet domestic contentment, planning the details of tomorrow's celebration while congratulating themselves on the perfect life they had built together. The attack came in the darkest hour before dawn, when sleep was deepest and defenses were lowest, when even the most paranoid protections were focused outward rather than on threats that might already be inside the perimeter. Greyback moved through the cottage's magical wards like smoke through a sieve, his werewolf nature allowing him to pass undetected through barriers designed to stop human intruders, but inadequate against creatures whose essential nature was something other than purely human. The window of Remus's bedroom offered no resistance to claws that could rend stone, its cheerful curtains decorated with dancing animals that seemed to mock the reality of what was about to unfold. The child slept peacefully in his small bed, surrounded by toys and books that spoke of innocence and wonder, completely unaware that his life was about to be divided into before and after this moment, that the boy who fell asleep dreaming of birthday cake would wake as something else entirely. Greyback's transformation of the sleeping child was swift and methodical, designed to inflict the curse of lycanthropy while leaving the victim alive to experience its full horror. The bite was placed with surgical precision, deep enough to ensure transmission of the condition, but calculated to avoid major arteries that might cause fatal blood loss. This was not murder, but something far more sophisticated, the creation of a living reminder of the price of prejudice, a weapon turned against the man who had dared to speak such passionate hatred for creatures like the one he was about to become. The child's screams pierced the cottage's peaceful silence like daggers of pure agony, instantly transforming the sanctuary of domestic happiness into a scene from nightmares. Hope's cry of maternal terror harmonized with her son's pain, creating a symphony of horror that would echo in Lyle's memory for the rest of his life. The sound of running feet, slamming doors, desperate incantations, all of it played out against the backdrop of Remus's continued screaming as the curse began its work in his small body. Lyle's arrival in his son's bedroom was perhaps the cruelest moment in the entire orchestrated revenge, for he arrived in time to see everything, but just too late to prevent anything. Greyback stood over the child's bed like a nightmare made flesh, his face twisted with satisfaction at a job perfectly executed, his eyes meeting Lyle's with the triumphant gleam of someone who had achieved exactly what he intended. The window stood open to the night air, offering escape for someone whose supernatural speed would make pursuit futile. The curses that Lyle unleashed in that moment carried all the fury and desperation of a father whose child had been destroyed before his eyes. They were powered by love and rage in equal measure, guided by expertise that made them devastatingly effective against most opponents. But Greyback had planned for this contingency, had studied his target's capabilities, and prepared countermeasures that allowed him to escape with nothing worse than superficial wounds that would heal within hours. As the werewolf vanished into the darkness beyond the cottage, leaving behind only the lingering scent of wild places and the echo of mocking laughter, Lial turned to face the wreckage of his perfect life. His son lay in his small bed, blood staining the cheerful sheets, his face pale with shock and pain, but his eyes still holding the trust and innocence that made this violation so profoundly cruel. Hope knelt beside the bed, her hands hovering over wounds she could not heal, her voice breaking with prayers to gods who seemed to have abandoned them in their moment of greatest need. The immediate medical response was everything that magical healing could provide, but it could not undo what had been done or restore what had been taken. Street. Mungo's healers worked through the night to save the child's life, their skills preventing death but powerless against the curse that had already taken root in his blood. The bite wounds would heal, but they would leave scars that would mark him forever as one of the creatures his father had condemned with such passionate certainty. The confirmation of what they already knew came with the next full moon, when their beloved son underwent his first transformation. The experience was agony beyond description, for a child whose body was never meant to contain such violence, whose innocent mind could not comprehend the forces tearing him apart from within. Hope and Lyle watched helplessly as their little boy disappeared beneath fur and fangs, replaced by a creature whose golden eyes held no recognition of the love that surrounded him. The wolf that their son became was savage in its desperation, clawing and biting at everything within reach in its frantic need to find prey that could satisfy hungers no human food could appease. In the absence of other victims, it turned its fury upon itself, leaving wounds that would become permanent scars on the human body that returned with the dawn. Each month brought fresh marks, new evidence of the violence that lived within their gentle child, proof of the monster that shared his small body. Lyle's guilt was a living thing that consumed him from within, feeding on the knowledge that his words had brought this horror upon his family. The passionate denunciation of werewolves that had seemed so righteous in the committee room now echoed in his mind with horrible irony, each syllable a prophecy fulfilled in the most personal way possible. He had called werewolves soulless and evil, deserving nothing but death, and now his own beloved son carried that curse in his blood. The cure that Lial sought with desperate intensity proved as elusive as hope itself. Every text he consulted, every expert he contacted, every experimental treatment he attempted ended in the same conclusion. Lycanthropy was permanent, incurable, a condition that could be managed but never eliminated. The child he loved more than life itself would carry this burden forever, would face monthly agony and daily prejudice for crimes he had never committed and sins he was too young to understand. The family's isolation began immediately, though it took months to become complete. Fellow wizards and witches who had once welcomed them began to find excuses to avoid contact, their discomfort with the child's condition manifesting as cruel distance that left hope, struggling to maintain friendships that withered under the weight of unspoken fear. Neighbors reported suspicious noises and strange disturbances that coincided with the full moon, their concerns leading to investigations that forced the family to relocate with increasing frequency. Each new town brought temporary hope that this time would be different, that they could find a community willing to accept their situation and help them build something approaching normal life. But the pattern always repeated itself. Initial, cautious acceptance, followed by growing suspicion as Remus's condition became apparent, culminating in the kind of hostility that made remaining in any location impossible. The boy himself, too young to fully understand the nature of his condition but old enough to recognize his family's distress, began to withdraw into himself, as each failed attempt at integration taught him that he was somehow different, somehow wrong in ways that made other people afraid. His 5th birthday, which should have been celebrated with joy and laughter, passed in a cottage where the decorations seemed to mock their attempt at normalcy, and the presents felt like consolation prizes for a childhood that had ended before it could properly begin. Hope struggled to maintain the cheerful demeanor that had once come naturally to her, but the strain of constant vigilance and repeated displacement was wearing her down in ways that no amount of love could overcome. She watched her husband blame himself for circumstances beyond any reasonable person's control, while their son grew increasingly isolated from the world of normal children, and she felt her own strength ebbing with each passing day. The cottage that had once been their sanctuary became a prison, where they waited each month for the horror that would transform their gentle boy into something they had to contain and conceal. The rooms that had echoed with laughter now held only whispered conversations about security measures and escape plans, about how to explain their son's scars to suspicious neighbors, and how to muffle the sounds that might betray their secret to authorities who would not understand. Lyle's career at the ministry ended as abruptly as his family's happiness, his association with a werewolf child making him a liability that his superiors could not afford to overlook. The expertise that had once made him valuable became irrelevant when weighed against the security risk his personal circumstances represented, and he found himself dismissed with a kind of bureaucratic efficiency that left no room for appeals or explanations. The financial pressures that followed compounded every other difficulty they faced, turning their search for safe housing into a desperate scramble for accommodations they could afford while still maintaining the isolation their son's condition required. Each relocation cost money they could not spare. Each new set of defensive enchantments drained resources they needed for basic survival, and the growing medical expenses associated with treating self-inflicted injuries after each transformation created debts that seemed impossible to repay. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of their situation was watching Remus lose the carefree joy that had once defined his personality. The boy who had laughed with pure delight at simple pleasures became quiet and watchful, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated when adults were becoming suspicious of his family's presence. He stopped asking about other children, stopped expressing desires for toys or treats that might require interaction with the world beyond their constantly changing homes. As his 10th birthday approached, the family had reached a state of weary acceptance that their situation would never improve, that they were condemned to an existence of perpetual flight and concealment. The boy had grown stronger with each passing year, and his transformed state had become correspondingly more dangerous, requiring increasingly sophisticated containment measures that stretched their magical abilities to their limits. The wounds he inflicted upon himself during each transformation had covered his small body with scars that told the story of his condition more clearly than any explanation could have provided. Teachers, who might have overlooked other signs of difference, could not ignore the evidence of violence that marked him so obviously, and the family had given up any pretense of normal education in favor of complete homeschooling that left them even more isolated from the world they had once hoped to rejoin. Hope's health had begun to decline under the constant stress of their nomadic existence, while Lyle had aged years in the decades since Greyback's attack, his hair showing premature grey and his face bearing lines of worry that spoke of sorrows no parent should have to bear. They loved their son with desperate intensity, but they had begun to lose hope that love would be enough to give him any kind of meaningful future. The cottage they occupied on Remus's 10th birthday was particularly dismal, its walls thin enough to require extensive silencing charms, and its isolation so complete that even owls seemed reluctant to deliver mail to such a desolate location. The birthday celebration they attempted was a shadow of the joyous occasions they had once imagined sharing, marked more by what was absent than by what remained of their family's former happiness. But in the darkness of their despair, neither parent could have imagined that salvation was already on its way, carried in the person of someone who had spent decades learning to see past surface differences to the fundamental worth that lay beneath. Albus Dumbledore's eventual arrival would transform their story from tragedy to hope. But for now, they could only endure, holding on to each other, and to the love that had survived every test their terrible circumstances could devise. The child who would someday become Professor Lupin, beloved teacher and defender of the innocent, sat in that dismal cottage dreaming of a normal life that seemed forever beyond his reach, not knowing that his greatest contributions to the world would grow directly from the suffering he was experiencing. His scars would become sources of empathy, his isolation would teach him to value connection, and his condition would make him the perfect champion for everyone who had ever felt different, dangerous, or unwanted. But such understanding lay years in the future, beyond trials that would test every limit of human endurance and love. For now, there was only the daily struggle to survive, to maintain hope in the face of impossible circumstances, and to believe that somehow, somewhere, someone might see past the monster. To the boy who still lived beneath the curse that had stolen his childhood and threatened to claim his future. The years that followed Remus's transformation had settled into a rhythm of quiet desperation that the Lupin family had learned to navigate with the weary expertise of people who had no choice but to adapt or perish. Their current cottage, isolated in the Welsh mountains, where the nearest neighbour lived 3 miles away through treacherous terrain, represented perhaps their most successful attempt at creating a sustainable existence since the night that had changed everything forever. The building itself was ancient and somewhat ramshackle, its stone walls thick enough to muffle sounds that might otherwise carry to unwanted ears, its windows small and deep-set, in the manner of structures built for defense rather than comfort. Hope had done her best to make it homelike, but the constant need for security measures meant that every room bore signs of their peculiar circumstances. Reinforced doors that could withstand supernatural strength, walls inscribed with containment runes that glowed faintly in certain light, furniture arranged to provide clear sightlines, and multiple escape routes. Lyle had thrown himself into his son's education with the desperate intensity of someone who understood that knowledge might be the only legacy he could provide for a child whose future seemed so constrained by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The cottage's largest room had been converted into a classroom where ancient texts shared shelf space with modern treatises, where magical theory was taught alongside practical applications that no normal curriculum would have included. Remus, now 10 years old and bearing the accumulated scars of 5 years of monthly transformations, had proven himself to be remarkably intelligent despite the limitations of his isolated upbringing. His hunger for knowledge seemed to grow with each passing month, as if learning offered him a refuge from the physical and emotional pain that defined so much of his existence. He devoured books with the same intensity that his transformed self showed toward less innocent pursuits, absorbing information with a speed and comprehension that would have impressed teachers at the finest schools. But intelligence could not erase the loneliness that had become his constant companion. The boy who should have been making friends and exploring the world beyond his family's protective walls instead spent his days in solitary study, his only companions, the characters he encountered in books, and the creatures he observed from the cottage's windows. His parents' love surrounded him like a warm cloak, but even the most devoted attention could not entirely fill the void left by the absence of peers who might have shared his interests and experiences. Hope watched her son's isolation with a mother's aching heart, understanding that no amount of domestic comfort could compensate for the friendships and adventures that normal childhood should have provided. She saw how he paused sometimes while reading, staring out at the distant mountains with an expression that mixed longing with resignation, as if he were imagining a different life, but had already accepted that such dreams were beyond his reach. The scars that marked his body told the story of his condition more clearly than any explanation could have provided, a map of violence written in raised flesh that spoke of monthly battles fought against an enemy that lived within his own skin. Each transformation left new marks, fresh evidence of the war between human consciousness and animal instinct that raged in his small frame with predictable regularity. Lyle had long since exhausted every possible avenue for finding a cure, his research leading him through the darkest corners of magical medicine, only to discover that lycanthropy remained as incurable as it was incurable. The best he could hope for was to help his son develop coping strategies that might make the condition more bearable, techniques for mental discipline that could maintain some thread of human awareness even during the depths of transformation. The approaching full moon cast its shadow over their household routine with the same inevitability as changing seasons, bringing with it the familiar preparations that had become as natural as breathing. The cottage's cellar had been converted into a secure chamber where Remus could transform in relative safety, its walls reinforced with both physical barriers and magical containment spells that grew more sophisticated with each passing month as the boy's strength increased. The transformation itself remained as agonizing as ever, a process that twisted human anatomy into shapes it was never meant to assume, while consciousness flickered between rational thought and bestial hunger. Hope and Lyle took turns, maintaining the vigil that each full moon required, listening to sounds from below that no parent should ever have to hear, counting the hours until dawn would bring back the sun they recognized. Recovery took longer with each passing month, as Remus's body bore the accumulated stress of years of unnatural change. The wounds he inflicted upon himself in his frustrated search for prey healed slowly, requiring careful tending and magical assistance that drained the family's limited resources while serving as constant reminders of the violence that lived beneath his gentle exterior. It was during one particularly difficult recovery period, when infection had set in despite their best efforts, and fever had left the boy delirious with pain, that hope finally voiced the fear that had been growing in both parents' hearts for months. Perhaps it would be kinder to end his suffering, to spare him the decades of monthly agony that stretched ahead of him like an endless corridor of torment. Perhaps love sometimes required the courage to let go, rather than the stubbornness to hold on regardless of cost. Lyle's response had been swift and absolute, his refusal to consider such a course carrying the force of religious conviction. Their son was not a monster to be destroyed, but a child to be protected, not a burden to be discarded, but a miracle to be cherished, despite the pain that shadowed his existence. Whatever the future held, they would face it together as a family, united by bonds that no curse could entirely sever. But even as they reaffirmed their commitment to their son's survival, both parents struggled with the growing certainty that his future held little hope for the kind of fulfillment that made existence worthwhile. The isolation that his condition demanded seemed likely to continue indefinitely, cutting him off from the companionship and purpose that gave meaning to human life. The best they could offer him was survival, and some days that seemed like cruel mercy rather than genuine love. The morning that would change everything began with the same quiet routine that had governed their lives for years, though neither Hope nor Lyle noticed anything unusual in the way sunlight fell through their kitchen windows, or how the mountain air carried scents of approaching autumn. Remus was recovering from his latest transformation, his wounds healing cleanly for once, his spirits somewhat improved by a new book of poetry that his mother had managed to acquire from a traveling merchant. The knock at their door came just after breakfast, carrying an authority that made both parents freeze with the instinctive fear of people whose lives depended on remaining unnoticed. Visitors were rare in their remote location, and those who did find their way to the cottage usually came with news or purposes that boded ill for a family whose very existence violated the social norms that governed wizarding society. Hope moved to block the entrance while Lyle positioned himself where he could defend their son if necessary, both of them prepared for the confrontation that experience had taught them to expect whenever their secret was discovered. The possibility that this visitor might represent some form of help rather than threat had not occurred to either of them, so accustomed had they become to assuming the worst from every unexpected encounter. But the voice that called through the door carried tones of warmth and patience rather than authority or aggression, speaking their names with a familiarity that suggested knowledge rather than suspicion. When Hope finally opened the door, she found herself face to face with someone whose reputation preceded him so thoroughly that recognition was immediate despite their never having met in person. Albus Dumbledore stood on their threshold like a figure from legend made manifest, his tall frame draped in robes that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light, his long beard and half-moon spectacles giving him an appearance that was both grandfatherly and mysteriously powerful. But it was his eyes that captured Hope's attention most completely. Blue orbs that seemed to hold depths of understanding and compassion that made her feel suddenly, inexplicably safe. The great wizard's presence transformed their humble cottage simply by occupying it, his mere existence in their space making everything seem somehow more significant, more hopeful than it had moments before. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but it was tempered with kindness that made his commands feel more like invitations to participate in something wonderful rather than demands for compliance. Within minutes of his arrival, The carefully maintained barriers that the Lupin family had built around their secret were dissolved as completely as morning mist before the Sunday. Dumbledore's knowledge of their situation was comprehensive and specific, extending to details that they had shared with no one, information that could only have been gathered through magical means that operated far beyond the reach of conventional investigation. He knew about Greyback's attack and the revenge that had motivated it. He understood the monthly cycle of transformation and the toll it took on both Remus and his parents. He was aware of their constant relocations and the isolation that had become the defining characteristic of their existence. Most remarkably, he seemed to grasp the emotional landscape of their lives with an empathy that made each of them feel truly seen for the first time in years. But knowledge was only the beginning of what Dumbledore offered. As he sat in their modest sitting room, somehow making their poor furniture seem adequate to host such a distinguished guest, he began to outline a proposal that would have seemed impossible if offered by anyone with less authority and reputation for achieving the impossible. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, he explained, was prepared to accept Remus as a student despite his condition. The castle's ancient magic and extensive grounds could be adapted to provide a safe environment for his monthly transformations, while the school's commitment to education would ensure that his intellectual gifts received the cultivation they deserved. For the first time since Greyback's attack, their son could have the chance at a normal childhood. The practical arrangements that Dumbledore described were both elegant and comprehensive, demonstrating the kind of planning that could only have been accomplished by someone who understood both the magical and emotional complexities involved. The village of Hogsmeade, which lay adjacent to the school grounds, contained an old house that could be specially prepared for Remus's use during his transformations. The building would be warded beyond any possibility of escape or external detection, providing security for both the boy and the community that would unknowingly shelter him. Access to this sanctuary would be provided through an underground tunnel that connected directly to the Hogwarts grounds, allowing Remus to reach his place of confinement without risk of discovery by other students or villagers who might not understand his condition. The entrance to this tunnel would be guarded by a specially planted whomping willow, a tree whose violent nature would discourage curious exploration while providing a natural explanation for any sounds that might carry from below during transformation nights. The deception required to maintain this arrangement was as carefully planned as the physical accommodations. The house would be known to locals as the Shrieking Shack, supposedly haunted by violent spirits whose presence explained the terrible noises that emerged from it each month. This reputation would serve the dual purpose of keeping people away while providing a cover story that satisfied their natural curiosity without revealing the truth. As Dumbledore outlined these preparations, his eyes remained fixed on Remus, who had appeared in the doorway during the discussion and stood listening with the kind of intense attention that suggested he was afraid to breathe, lest this magical possibility disappear like so many dreams before it. The boy's face showed a mixture of desperate hope and protective disbelief, the expression of someone who had learned not to trust in good fortune lest disappointment proved too crushing to bear. But Dumbledore's attention to the child was gentle and direct, acknowledging his presence with the respect due to someone whose opinion mattered in decisions that would shape his future. When he spoke to Remus, his voice carried the same warmth he had shown the boy's parents, along with an additional quality that suggested he saw not a problem to be managed, but a person deserving of every opportunity that could be provided. The question he posed was simple but profound. Would Remus like to come to Hogwarts and learn magic alongside other children his age? Would he be interested in making friends and discovering the wider wizarding world that had been closed to him for so long? Did he want the chance to be a normal student despite the extraordinary measures that his condition would require? Remus's response came not in words, but in an expression that transformed his entire face lighting it with joy so pure and overwhelming that it seemed to illuminate the cottage's dim interior. This was the dream that had sustained him through years of isolation and pain, the possibility that had seemed so impossible that he had barely dared to acknowledge it, even in his most private thoughts. Hope felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her son's reaction, understanding that she was witnessing a moment that would divide his life as clearly as Greyback's attack had done, though this time the division would be between despair and hope rather than innocence and suffering. Lyle's own emotions were too complex for easy expression, mixing gratitude toward Dumbledore with amazement that such an offer was even possible, along with fears about whether his son could handle the social complexities that normal school life would require. But beneath their concerns lay a growing certainty that this opportunity represented everything they had hoped for and more than they had dared to expect. Their son would not have to spend his life in isolation, would not be condemned to an existence defined entirely by his monthly curse. He could have friends, teachers, adventures, the chance to discover who he might become when freed from the constraints that had shaped his childhood. The practical details that followed were handled with the efficiency that characterized all of Dumbledore's arrangements. The family would relocate to a cottage near Hogsmeade, close enough to provide emotional support but far enough to allow Remus the independence that healthy development required. His transformation schedule would be coordinated with the school calendar to minimize disruptions to his education. Most importantly, his condition would remain secret, known only to those whose knowledge was essential for maintaining the arrangements. The trust that such secrecy required was not lost on any of them. Dumbledore was placing his reputation and the school's safety on his judgment that Remus could be both student and werewolf without one identity destroying the other. The boy himself would carry the burden of constant vigilance, ensuring that his secret remained hidden from classmates who might not understand the difference between the curse and the person who bore it. As the great wizard prepared to leave, having provided more hope in a single visit than the family had experienced in 5 years, he paused to offer one final piece of advice. The years ahead would not be easy, and the temptations to reveal or conceal too much would be constant. Success would require balance, enough openness to form meaningful friendships, enough caution to protect both himself and others from the consequences of discovery. The cottage felt different after Dumbledore's departure, charged with possibility in ways that made even familiar objects seem new and full of promise. The books that had been Remus's only companions now represented preparation for a wider world of learning. The scars that had marked him as different became simply part of his history rather than the defining characteristic of his future. Hope found herself planning for the first time in years, imagining a life that extended beyond the next full moon to encompass seasons and years of growth and discovery. Lial began composing letters to magical suppliers, ordering books and equipment that would help prepare his son for an educational experience that had seemed impossible just hours before. But it was Remus himself who showed the greatest transformation, his entire demeanor shifting from resigned acceptance to eager anticipation. The boy who had learned to expect disappointment from every source now allowed himself to believe in possibilities that stretched beyond his previous imagination, dreams of friendship and belonging that had been carefully suppressed for so long that acknowledging them felt almost dangerous. The weeks that followed were filled with preparations that felt like extended celebrations, each purchase an arrangement, bringing them closer to a future that had once seemed as distant as the stars. School robes were fitted and magical supplies were acquired, while textbooks were studied with an intensity that reflected not just academic interest, but genuine excitement about the learning that lay ahead. The greatest joy came from the simple act of shopping in Diagon Alley, alongside other families preparing for the school year, blending into the crowd of parents and children whose concerns were wonderfully ordinary. For a few precious hours, they could pretend to be normal, to share in the excitement and anxiety that characterized every family sending a child away to school for the first time. The trunk that they packed was more than a container for possessions, but a symbol of transformation, holding not just clothes and books, but the promise of a life that could extend beyond the limitations that had defined Remus's childhood. Each item placed within it represented a vote of confidence in a future that would allow him to grow into whoever he was meant to become. The night before his departure for Hogwarts, Remus lay in his bed staring at the ceiling and trying to comprehend the magnitude of the change that tomorrow would bring. The cottage that had been both shelter and prison for so many years would become just a memory, replaced by a castle filled with other children who shared his love of learning and magic. Hope and Lyle spent that final evening together as a family, sharing memories of the difficult years they had survived while looking forward to the adventures that awaited their remarkable son. They spoke of their pride in his courage and resilience, of their gratitude to Dumbledore for seeing possibilities where others had seen only problems, of their excitement about the person he would become when given the chance to flourish. The morning that would mark the beginning of Remus Lupin's true education dawned bright and clear, as if the weather itself was celebrating this momentous transition. The journey to King's Cross Station felt like a pilgrimage to a shrine of possibility, each mile bringing them closer to the moment when their son would step into a larger world that was prepared to welcome him despite everything that made him different. Standing on platform 9 3/4, surrounded by other families saying their goodbyes, the Lupins could hardly believe that this moment had finally arrived. The scarlet engine of the Hogwarts Express waited with steam rising from its chimney like incense from an altar, ready to carry their son toward a destiny that had once seemed impossible but now felt inevitable. Remus's farewell to his parents was brief but profound, carrying all the gratitude and love that years of shared struggle had created between them. He understood that this opportunity represented not just his own liberation but theirs as well, freeing them from the constant vigilance that his condition had required, while giving them the chance to watch him become whoever he was meant to be. As the train pulled away from the station, carrying him toward Hogwarts and the friendships that would define the rest of his life, Remus pressed his face to the window and watched his parents grow smaller in the distance. They stood together on the platform, waving until the train curved out of sight, their faces bright with joy and anticipation for the adventures that awaited their extraordinary son. The boy who had spent his childhood believing that he was doomed to a life of isolation and secrecy was finally free to discover what lay beyond those limitations, to find out whether the dreams he had barely dared to acknowledge might actually be within his reach. The greatest adventure of his life was about to begin, and for the first time in years, the future stretched ahead of him bright with possibility rather than shadowed by fear. The ancient castle of Hogwarts rose from the Scottish Highlands like a dream made manifest in stone and magic, its towers piercing the morning mist, with spires that seemed to reach towards secrets hidden in the very stars themselves. As the Hogwarts Express wound its way through the countryside, carrying its precious cargo of young witches and wizards toward their destinies, Remus Lupin pressed his face to the compartment window and felt his heart swell with emotions too vast and complex for his 11-year-old vocabulary to encompass. The journey itself had been a revelation, sharing space with other children his age who spoke casually of magic and adventure, who took for granted the very experiences that had been denied to him for so long. He had listened to their conversations with the hungry attention of someone tasting forbidden fruit, absorbing every casual reference to spells and potions and magical creatures that existed beyond the pages of the books that had been his only companions. When the sorting hat was placed upon his head in the great hall, its ancient consciousness sifting through his memories and possibilities with the thoroughness of a scholar examining a particularly fascinating manuscript, Remus felt a moment of pure terror that his secret might be discovered before his new life had even begun. But the hat's announcement of Gryffindor rang through the hall like a bell of liberation, welcoming him into a house known for courage and acceptance, qualities that would prove essential for the friendships he was about to form. The dormitory that became his first real home away from the cottage was a revelation of normalcy that brought tears to his eyes in the darkness of his first night. 4 beds arranged around a circular room, each belonging to a boy his own age, each representing a friendship waiting to be discovered. The sounds of other children settling into sleep, the whispered conversations that gradually faded into gentle snores, the simple miracle of belonging somewhere. All of it felt like emerging from a long tunnel into brilliant sunlight. His roommates were as different from one another as 4 boys could possibly be. Yet their differences seemed to complement rather than divide them in ways that created natural harmony within their shared space. James Potter possessed the kind of effortless confidence that came from being loved unconditionally since birth. His natural leadership abilities balanced by a mischievous streak that made him equally willing to break rules and defend those who needed protection. Sirius Black carried himself with the aristocratic bearing that generations of pure-blood breeding had instilled, but beneath his polished exterior burned a rebellious spirit that had already begun to reject everything his family represented. His friendship came with the intensity of someone who had been starved of genuine affection. His loyalty absolute once given but withheld until trust was earned through shared experiences and mutual respect. Peter Pettigrew seemed almost overwhelmed by the company he found himself keeping, his natural timidity and slower wit making him appear more follower than leader, more audience than actor, in the dramas that would unfold around them. Yet his eagerness to please and desperate desire for acceptance made him valuable to boys who were learning the importance of having someone who would always support their adventures and celebrate their victories. Into this constellation of personalities, Remus brought qualities that balanced and enhanced what each of his new friends offered. His gentleness tempered James's sometimes thoughtless enthusiasm, while his intelligence provided depth to conversations that might otherwise have remained on surfaces. His instinctive sympathy for underdogs created bridges between his more confident roommates and the wider world of students who needed champions and protectors. The friendship that developed between the 4 boys was unlike anything any of them had experienced before, deeper and more immediate than the casual associations that characterize most childhood relationships. They seemed to understand intuitively that they had found something precious and rare, a connection that transcended the ordinary boundaries of age and circumstance to touch something eternal about the nature of loyalty and love. But even as Remus basked in the warmth of acceptance and belonging, the secret of his condition cast shadows over every interaction, creating moments of anxiety and careful maneuvering that his friends could not help but notice. His monthly disappearances were explained through increasingly elaborate stories about sick relatives and family emergencies, tales that grew more complex with each repetition as he struggled to maintain consistency in his deceptions. The physical changes that preceded each transformation, the pallor that crept across his features, the exhaustion that seemed to drain him from within, the subtle alterations in his scent that animals noticed, even when humans remained oblivious, all of these required careful management and constant vigilance. He learned to schedule his absences strategically, timing them to coincide with weekends or holidays when his disappearance would attract less attention from both students and faculty. The Shrieking Shack became both sanctuary and prison, the place where he could safely undergo his monthly transformation while remaining close enough to the school that his absence wouldn't extend beyond believable limits. The underground tunnel that connected the castle grounds to his place of confinement felt like a bridge between 2 worlds, the human realm where he was beloved and accepted, and the bestial dimension where he lost all trace of the gentle boy his friends cherished. Dumbledore's arrangements proved flawless in their execution, the Whomping Willow serving its dual purpose of concealing the tunnel entrance while providing a natural explanation for why that particular area of the grounds remained unexplored by curious students. The tree's violent nature created a buffer zone that kept even the most adventurous young wizards at a safe distance, ensuring that Remus's secret remained protected by forces beyond his own ability to maintain. The legend of the Shrieking Shack that spread through Hogsmeade Village was everything Dumbledore had hoped it would become, a ghost story compelling enough to satisfy local curiosity while ensuring that no one would investigate the true source of the terrible sounds that echoed from within during each full moon. The villagers took pride in their haunted house, regarding it as a local attraction that added mysterious charm to their community, rather than a genuine threat requiring investigation. But maintaining such elaborate deceptions took its toll on Remus's peace of mind, creating a constant undercurrent of anxiety that threatened to overwhelm the joy he found in his friendships. Each lie required additional lies to support it. Each evasion demanded more complex explanations, until the simple truth of his condition seemed buried beneath layers of necessary fiction that grew heavier with each passing month. His friends, meanwhile, had begun to notice patterns in his behavior that their sharp minds couldn't help but analyze. James's natural leadership instincts made him protective of anyone in his circle, and Remus's obvious distress during certain periods triggered every heroic impulse in the boy's generous heart. Sirius, with his aristocratic education in reading people's intentions and hidden motives, recognized signs of concealment that spoke of secrets significant enough to cause genuine anguish. Even Peter, despite his limitations in other areas, possessed the kind of observational skills that came from spending his life on the periphery of more dynamic personalities, watching and learning from his position as eternal audience to other people's dramas. The inconsistencies in Remus's stories, the timing of his illnesses, the way his absences coincided with predictable celestial events, all of these details accumulated in minds that were too intelligent and too caring to remain indefinitely fooled. The investigation that his friends began was conducted with the same thoroughness they brought to their academic work, but motivated by love rather than mere curiosity. They compiled evidence with the patience of professional researchers, cross-referenced his absences with astronomical calendars, and gradually constructed a theory that explained every anomaly they had observed in his behavior. The revelation, when it finally came, occurred not through dramatic confrontation, but through the gradual accumulation of understanding that made denial impossible for any of them to maintain. They had worked out the truth through careful observation and logical deduction, but their knowledge came wrapped in the kind of protective love that made acceptance inevitable rather than frightening. Remus's terror at discovery was matched only by his amazement at their response, which bore no resemblance to the rejection and horror he had spent years dreading. Instead of backing away in fear or disgust, his friends moved closer with the protective instincts of pack animals defending one of their own. Their acceptance was absolute and immediate, transforming his greatest shame into simply another aspect of who he was, no more significant than the color of his eyes or his preference for particular subjects. The practical response to their discovery demonstrated the kind of innovative thinking that would characterize their friendship throughout their school years and beyond. Rather than simply offering sympathy and support, they immediately began planning ways to transform his monthly ordeal from solitary suffering into shared adventure, approaching the challenge with the same enthusiasm they brought to their academic pursuits and recreational mischief. The decision to become animagi was both generous and reckless in the way that only teenage boys could achieve, requiring years of dangerous magical study that pushed the boundaries of what students their age should have attempted. The transformation process was complex beyond anything covered in their regular curriculum, demanding not just magical skill, but psychological discipline that tested every limit of their dedication to their friends' well-being. James's stag form embodied the nobility and strength that had always defined his character, his antlers serving as both weapons and symbols of the protective leadership he provided to their group. The grace with which he moved through forests that would have challenged human navigation reflected the natural authority that made him the undisputed leader of their adventures, the one whose judgment they trusted when difficult decisions required immediate action. Sirius's transformation into a massive black dog revealed aspects of his personality that his aristocratic upbringing had taught him to conceal, unleashing the playful and affectionate nature that pure-blood expectations had forced him to suppress. His canine form was larger and more powerful than any normal dog, as if his magical nature had enhanced even his animal shape, making him an ideal companion for a werewolf whose monthly transformations demanded strength and endurance from anyone brave enough to share his experience. Peter's rat form seemed almost comically inappropriate for someone seeking to befriend a werewolf, but his small size and natural agility made him perfectly suited for reconnaissance and communication roles that their more obvious animal forms could not fulfill. His ability to squeeze through spaces that would stop his friends, combined with his talent for remaining unnoticed even in plain sight, proved invaluable during their nocturnal expeditions beyond the castle's normal boundaries. But it was the psychological transformation that accompanied their physical changes that truly revolutionized Remus's experience of his condition. For the first time since Greyback's attack, his monthly transformations became occasions for companionship rather than isolation, adventures shared with friends whose love had overcome even the barriers between species and consciousness that his lycanthropy created. The wolf that Remus became in the presence of his friends was gentler and more controlled than the savage creature that had spent years tearing at itself in frustrated bloodlust. Their animal presence seemed to awaken dormant pack instincts that channeled his predatory nature into play rather than violence, transforming nights of agony into experiences that approached joy despite the physical pain that transformation would always require. Their adventures during these nights became the foundation of legends that would persist long after their school years ended. Tales of 4 animals moving through the Scottish Highlands with supernatural coordination and purpose. They explored territories that human students never saw, discovering caves and clearings and ancient ruins that held secrets dating back to Hogwarts' founding, mapping a hidden geography that existed parallel to the mundane world that daylight revealed. The Marauders' map that grew from their explorations was more than a simple architectural diagram, but a living document that captured the dynamic essence of the castle and its surroundings. The magic they wove into its parchment reflected their understanding of Hogwarts, not as a static structure, but as a breathing entity whose passages and chambers shifted according to rhythms that most inhabitants never learned to recognize. Their nicknames, Moony, Prongs, Padfoot, and Wormtail, became more than simple identifiers, but magical sigils that bound them together across the boundaries of human and animal consciousness. The names carried power that transcended their literal meanings, creating connections that would persist long after the circumstances that created them had been forgotten by everyone except the 4 friends who had shared experiences that few people could imagine, and fewer still could understand. The mapping process itself became a bonding ritual that strengthened their friendship through shared purpose and collective achievement. Each new passage discovered and documented represented another victory for their alliance, proof that their combined abilities could overcome obstacles that would have defeated any individual effort. The completion of their map felt like graduation from some advanced course in friendship, marking their transition from casual roommates to brothers bound by experiences that could never be replicated or replaced. But their adventures also brought them into contact with other students and faculty members in ways that occasionally threatened the secrecy upon which everything depended. Severus Snape, with his natural suspicion and encyclopedic knowledge of dark arts symptoms, had begun to notice patterns in Remus's behavior that suggested explanations more sinister than simple illness or family obligations. The Slytherin boys' hostility toward James and Sirius created additional complications, as his desire to discredit them made him particularly attentive to any irregularities in their group's activities. His intelligence and persistence made him a formidable investigator whose discoveries could destroy everything they had built together, threatening not just Remus's place at Hogwarts but the safety of everyone who shared the school with an uncontrolled werewolf. The incident that nearly exposed everything began with Sirius's characteristic inability to resist pranks that pushed acceptable boundaries far beyond reasonable limits. His suggestion that Snape investigate the tunnel beneath the Whomping Willow was made in a moment of irritation rather than calculated malice, but the consequences could have been catastrophic for everyone involved. Snape's journey through the tunnel toward the Shrieking Shack demonstrated both his courage and his reckless determination to uncover secrets that others preferred to keep hidden. The confrontation he almost experienced with Remus in full werewolf form would have resulted in either death or transformation for the Slytherin boy, outcomes that would have destroyed multiple lives, while exposing truths that the wizarding world was not prepared to accept. James's rescue of Snape from certain doom was motivated by heroic instincts that overrode any personal animosity he might have felt toward his longtime rival. The risk he accepted in entering the tunnel during a full moon night demonstrated the kind of selfless courage that would later make him a natural leader in the war against Voldemort. The willingness to sacrifice personal safety for moral principles that defined true Gryffindor character. The aftermath of the incident created tensions within their group that took months to resolve, as Remus struggled with guilt over nearly causing his friends' deaths while James and Sirius dealt with the realization that their adventures carried consequences extending far beyond their immediate circle. The knowledge that Snape now possessed about Remus's condition hung over all of them like a sword suspended by increasingly fragile threads, threatening to fall at any moment and destroy everything they had built together. Dumbledore's intervention in managing the crisis demonstrated both his protective authority and his understanding of the complex dynamics that governed adolescent relationships. His ability to ensure Snape's silence while preserving the friendships that had created the problem in the first place required diplomatic skills that would have challenged experienced politicians, balancing competing interests and personalities with the wisdom that came from decades of similar challenges. The resolution that emerged from the crisis was stronger than what had existed before, tempered by shared recognition of how precious and fragile their friendship truly was. They had faced the possibility of losing everything and discovered that their bond was resilient enough to survive even such severe testing, creating confidence that would sustain them through the darker challenges that lay ahead in their futures. Remus's role as the moral center of their group became more pronounced as they matured. His natural empathy and hard-won understanding of suffering, making him the voice of conscience when their adventures threatened to cross lines that shouldn't be breached. His influence helped channel their collective energy toward goals that were constructive rather than merely mischievous, transforming them from simple troublemakers into champions for students who needed protection and advocacy. The prefect badge that arrived with his fifth-year letter felt like recognition not just of his academic achievements, but of the person he had become through friendship and acceptance. The responsibility it represented was both honor and burden, requiring him to balance his loyalty to his friends with his duty to maintain order among students who looked to him for guidance and example. The position created new complications, as James and Sirius continued their campaign of creative mischief, while expecting their friends' protection from consequences that their actions deserved. Remus found himself walking an increasingly narrow line between enabling behavior he couldn't approve of and betraying friends whose love had made his transformation from isolated outcast to respected leader possible. His relationship with Lily Evans during these later years provided him with perspectives on friendship and loyalty that his exclusively male relationships had never offered. Her combination of intelligence, moral clarity, and genuine kindness reminded him of his mother's best qualities, while challenging him to consider how his actions affected people beyond his immediate circle of companions. Lily's acceptance of his condition, when she inevitably learned the truth through careful observation and logical deduction, came without the dramatic revelations that had characterized his friend's discovery years earlier. Her matter-of-fact acknowledgement that he was still the same person she had always known, werewolf or not, provided validation from someone whose opinion he valued, but whose friendship hadn't been built around the excitement of sharing dangerous secrets. The approaching end of their school years brought with it awareness that their time of protected innocence was drawing to a close, that the world beyond Hogwarts would test their friendship in ways that academic challenges never could. The rise of Lord Voldemort cast shadows over their final months at school, creating urgency around their enjoyment of remaining opportunities to be simply students rather than soldiers in an approaching war. Their graduation ceremony felt like both ending and beginning, marking their transition from the roles they had played within Hogwarts' protective walls to the adult responsibilities that awaited them in a world growing darker with each passing day. The bonds they had forged through shared transformation and mutual acceptance would soon be tested by pressures that would challenge every assumption they held about loyalty, courage, and the price of standing against evil. The Order of the Phoenix that welcomed them represented everything their friendship had prepared them for, a community of people willing to risk everything to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, united by shared commitment to values that transcended personal safety or conventional success. Their inclusion in such august company felt like validation of everything they had learned about standing together against forces that sought to divide and destroy. But even as they prepared to face the adult world with confidence born of shared experience and mutual trust, none of them could have imagined the trials that awaited them, or the prices that their commitment to justice would eventually demand. The boy who had entered Hogwarts believing himself unworthy of friendship was graduating as someone whose capacity for love and loyalty would be tested by circumstances that would break lesser souls. The friendships that had transformed him from frightened outcast to confident young man would themselves be transformed by the crucible of war, revealing both their strength and their limitations, as forces beyond their control began to reshape the world they thought they understood. The magic they had learned in classrooms would prove less important than the magic they had created through acceptance and love, bonds that would persist even when everything else they cherished was stripped away by the approaching darkness. The man Remus would become had been forged in the dormitory, where four boys learned to trust each other completely, shaped by adventures that taught him the difference between courage and recklessness, tempered by experiences that showed him how love could overcome any obstacle except death itself. The greatest lessons of his life had been learned not from textbooks, but from friends who chose to see beyond the monster to the person within, who proved that acceptance was indeed the most powerful magic of all. The world that greeted the four friends upon their graduation from Hogwarts was one already beginning to fracture under the weight of forces that most wizarding families preferred not to acknowledge directly. Lord Voldemort's rise to power had progressed beyond the stage of whispered rumors and isolated incidents to become an undeniable reality that cast shadows across every aspect of magical society. Yet the Ministry of Magic continued to maintain facades of normalcy that fooled no one who bothered to look beneath the surface. James Potter's transition from beloved school hero to dedicated member of the Order of the Phoenix felt as natural as breathing, his innate sense of justice and protective instincts finding perfect expression in an organization devoted to defending the innocent against forces that acknowledged no moral boundaries. His leadership abilities, refined through years of directing marauder adventures, translated seamlessly to the more serious business of coordinating resistance operations against enemies whose sophistication far exceeded anything they had faced as students. Sirius Black's rejection of his family's dark affiliations became complete and irrevocable the moment he took his oath as an Order member, burning bridges that had already been weakened by years of philosophical disagreement and moral disgust. His intimate knowledge of pure-blood society's hidden networks and secret allegiances made him invaluable for intelligence gathering, while his natural courage and magical skill suited him perfectly for the kind of direct action that the war increasingly demanded. Peter Pettigrew's inclusion in their circle of resistance fighters was motivated more by loyalty to his friends than by any particular heroic instinct or ideological commitment to the cause they served. His willingness to follow where they led had served them well during school adventures, but the stakes of adult warfare would test his dedication in ways that academic mischief had never approached, revealing character flaws that had been easy to overlook when consequences remained manageable. But it was Remus who perhaps faced the greatest challenges in adapting to their new reality, for his lycanthropy created complications that extended far beyond personal inconvenience to encompass fundamental questions about trust, security, and the nature of the fight they had chosen to join. The Order's need for absolute discretion clashed with his monthly transformations, which required absences that could compromise missions and explanations that might reveal weaknesses enemies could exploit. The safe house that became his refuge during full moons was a grim reminder of how little his circumstances had truly changed despite the acceptance and friendship he had found at Hogwarts. The reinforced chamber where he underwent his transformations was more sophisticated than anything his parents had managed to arrange, but it remained essentially a prison where he was locked away from the world, while his human consciousness surrendered to animal instincts that recognized no loyalty except to the hunt. His friends' continued attempts to share these experiences with him carried new risks in the context of wartime operations, as their animagus transformations could not be registered with ministry authorities who might use such information to compromise Order security. The adventures that had once represented liberation from isolation now felt dangerous in their exposure of capabilities that could prove valuable to either side in the escalating conflict. The wedding of James and Lily Potter became a celebration not just of love triumphant, but of hope persisting in the face of darkness that seemed to grow stronger with each passing month. Remus stood among the witnesses to their union with emotions that mixed joy for his friend's happiness with melancholy recognition of realities that his own condition would likely never permit him to experience firsthand. The ceremony itself was conducted under protections that spoke eloquently of the times they lived in, with security measures that would have been unthinkable during peacetime weddings, but were now essential for any gathering that brought together known opponents of Voldemort's regime. The joy that filled the celebration was genuine but shadowed by awareness that such moments of happiness were becoming increasingly rare in a world that seemed determined to extinguish everything beautiful and good. Lily's acceptance of Remus as a treasured friend, despite full knowledge of his condition, represented a form of grace that he had learned not to expect from anyone outside his closest circle. Her kindness was neither condescending nor fearful, but simply natural, treating him as the person he was rather than the creature he became, offering friendship that required no extraordinary measures or special accommodations, but simply recognized his essential humanity. The birth of Harry Potter brought light into lives that had grown accustomed to shadow, providing tangible proof that love could create something beautiful even in the midst of warfare and uncertainty. Remus held the infant with the wonder of someone who had never expected to experience such proximity to new life, understanding intuitively that this child represented everything their struggle sought to protect and preserve. But even as he celebrated his friend's joy, Remus carried within himself the growing certainty that his own future would never encompass such blessings. The stigma attached to lycanthropy in wizarding society made marriage an impossible dream and fatherhood an unthinkable cruelty to any child unfortunate enough to inherit his condition. The loneliness that this knowledge brought was as much a part of his burden as the monthly transformations themselves, a constant reminder of the prices that his curse continued to exact from every aspect of his existence. The friendship that sustained him through these recognitions became more precious with each passing month, representing not just emotional support but practical necessity for someone whose other options for human connection remained severely limited. James and Sirius understood without being told that their acceptance of his condition carried responsibilities that extended far beyond simple tolerance, encompassing the kind of comprehensive loyalty that acknowledged no boundaries or limitations. The Order missions that occupied their days were conducted with the efficiency that characterized all of Dumbledore's operations, but they carried costs that accumulated in ways both obvious and subtle. Each successful mission saved lives, but also educated their enemies about resistance capabilities and methods, creating an arms race between innovation and adaptation that favored whichever side could learn faster from their mistakes and victories. Remus's contributions to Order operations were necessarily limited by the requirements of his condition, but his analytical abilities and deep understanding of marginalized magical creatures made him valuable for intelligence work that other members couldn't perform effectively. His insights into the psychology of beings who lived outside mainstream wizarding society provided strategic advantages that helped the Order anticipate enemy recruitment efforts among populations that conventional thinking would have overlooked. The growing frequency and sophistication of Death Eater attacks created an atmosphere of constant tension that affected every aspect of daily life, making simple activities like shopping or visiting friends exercises in risk assessment and security planning. The world that had once seemed stable and predictable revealed itself to be built on foundations far more fragile than anyone had realized, vulnerable to forces that could sweep away centuries of established order with frightening ease. But it was the personal costs of the war that proved most devastating to those who fought on the front lines of resistance against Voldemort's ambitions. The strain of constant vigilance and repeated exposure to violence began to show in ways both physical and psychological, wearing down defenders whose commitment to the cause never wavered, but whose human limitations became increasingly apparent as the conflict dragged on without clear resolution. The night of October 31st, 1981, began like any other evening in their war-torn world, with Order members scattered across Britain on missions whose success might mean the difference between victory and defeat for causes that seemed to hang in the balance with every passing hour. Remus had been assigned to reconnaissance duties in the northern counties, tracking reports of unusual Death Eater activity that might indicate preparation for major operations against targets the Order was committed to protecting. The magical communication that shattered his quiet surveillance was unlike anything he had experienced in years of Order service, carrying news so devastating and impossible that his mind initially refused to process its implications. James and Lily Potter were dead, killed by Lord Voldemort himself in an attack that should have been impossible given the protections that surrounded their hidden home. Their son Harry had somehow survived the encounter that claimed his parents, his miraculous preservation resulting in Voldemort's own apparent destruction and the sudden collapse of the Death Eater organization. The journey back to London felt like traveling through a landscape transformed by earthquake, familiar territories, rendered unrecognizable by events that challenged every assumption about the nature of their struggle and the possibilities for its resolution. The streets that had been empty due to fear were now filled with celebrating wizards who emerged from hiding to rejoice in victory that had come so suddenly and completely that it felt more like miracle than military achievement. But for Remus, the news carried implications that transcended any celebration of Voldemort's defeat or relief at the war's apparent conclusion. James and Lily were gone, their love story ended by violence that had claimed two of the finest people he had ever known, friends whose acceptance had made his own life bearable, and whose deaths left wounds that no amount of general rejoicing could begin to heal. The additional information that filtered through order networks over the following hours only deepened the scope of the tragedy that had befallen their circle. Sirius Black, the friend whose loyalty had never wavered throughout their school years and wartime service, had apparently been the traitor whose betrayal made the attack on James and Lily possible. Peter Pettigrew was dead, killed by Sirius, in what witnesses described as a fit of rage that ended with multiple Muggle deaths and Sirius's own capture by Ministry authorities. The impossibility of believing such reports warred with the evidence that seemed to support them, creating cognitive dissonance that threatened to overwhelm rational thought entirely. Sirius's capture and immediate imprisonment in Azkaban without trial suggested guilt so obvious that even the Ministry's notoriously slow justice system saw no need for formal proceedings, while Peter's death removed any possibility of learning the full truth about events that defied everything Remus thought he knew about his friends' characters. The isolation that descended upon him in the aftermath of these revelations was more complete than anything he had experienced since his early childhood, before Dumbledore's intervention had opened the door to friendship and belonging. The Order of the Phoenix dissolved as quickly as it had formed, its members returning to peacetime lives that he could not share, families that he could not join, futures that his condition would never permit him to pursue. The cottage where he had lived during his Order service became a monument to loneliness that stretched ahead of him like a desert whose far shores he could not imagine ever reaching. The rooms that had once echoed with planning sessions and strategic discussions now held only silence broken by the ticking of clocks that measured time he had no idea how to fill productively or meaningfully. His mother's death during this period of devastating loss felt like the final severance of connections that had anchored him to hope and purpose throughout the darkest periods of his life. Hope Lupin had aged rapidly during the war years, her worry for her son's safety compounding the natural decline that comes with advancing years, and her passing removed the last person on earth who loved him with the uncomplicated devotion that parents reserve for their children. The funeral was a small affair attended by neighbors who had known Hope as a kind woman whose son visited infrequently but devotedly, never suspecting the extraordinary circumstances that governed their relationship or the sacrifices that both had made to maintain even their limited connection. Standing beside her grave, Remus felt the weight of complete solitude settling upon him like a shroud that would define the remainder of his existence. His father, Lyle's invitation to return home was extended with love but declined with equal affection, based on understanding that had developed between them over years of separation, necessitated by circumstances neither could control. The old man deserved peace in his declining years, not the complications and dangers that proximity to a werewolf would inevitably bring to any household, no matter how protective its magical defenses might be. The employment that Remus sought in his new circumstances proved as elusive as meaningful human connection. His qualifications impressive, but ultimately irrelevant. When employers discovered the reasons behind his monthly absences and erratic availability, the pattern of hiring and dismissal that characterized his working life became so predictable that he began to anticipate the moment when each new position would end, watching for signs of suspicion and preparing explanations that grew less convincing with each repetition. The magical world's prejudice against werewolves extended far beyond employment discrimination to encompass every aspect of social and economic life, creating barriers that no amount of education or goodwill could overcome completely. Housing applications were rejected, business licenses denied, professional associations closed their doors to anyone whose condition marked them as fundamentally different from the normal wizarding population. The hand-to-mouth existence that became his reality was a constant reminder of how precarious life could become when society withdrew its support and protection from individuals it deemed unacceptable. The jobs he could obtain were invariably temporary, menial, and poorly paid, offering no prospects for advancement or security, but merely survival at the most basic level imaginable. The discovery of Wolfsbane potion represented a breakthrough that should have transformed his monthly experiences from ordeal into manageable inconvenience, providing hope that his condition might finally become compatible with something approaching normal life. The potion's ability to preserve human consciousness during transformation meant that the savage wolf that had terrorized his sleep for decades could be replaced by a docile creature that posed no threat to anyone. But hope proved as fleeting as every other improvement in his circumstances, as the potion's complex brewing requirements and expensive ingredients placed it far beyond his financial reach. The cruel irony of having a solution to his greatest problem while lacking the means to access it felt like a final judgment on the impossibility of his situation, proof that some curses could never be lifted no matter how close salvation might appear. The isolation that had once been mitigated by friendship and family support became absolute during these years, leaving him with no one to share either victories or defeats, celebrations or sorrows. The cottage he rented in remote locations changed frequently as suspicious neighbors or observant landlords noticed patterns that suggested explanations they preferred not to investigate, forcing him to relocate with the regularity that had characterized his childhood, but without the loving support that had made those moves bearable. The books that filled his cramped living spaces became his only reliable companions, offering intellectual stimulation and emotional escape that human relationships had once provided, but now seemed permanently beyond his reach. He read voraciously across all subjects, from advanced magical theory to Muggle literature, accumulating knowledge that served no practical purpose, but filled hours that might otherwise have been consumed by despair. The letters he wrote but never sent to friends he had lost became a form of communication with ghosts, attempts to maintain connections that existed only in his memory, but felt more real than any relationships available in his present circumstances. He told them about his struggles and disappointments, his small victories and recurring defeats, maintaining conversations that brought comfort even though they could never receive responses. The anniversaries of loss that punctuated his calendar, James and Lily's deaths, Peter's apparent murder, Sirius's imprisonment, his mother's passing, became annual rituals of remembrance that structured his otherwise shapeless existence around grief that never diminished, but never quite became unbearable. These observances were the closest thing to meaningful human connection that his life contained, moments when memory made solitude feel less like abandonment and more like faithful vigil. The wizarding world that celebrated its liberation from Voldemort's tyranny moved forward with the confidence of people who believed their victory was permanent and complete. rebuilding institutions and relationships with optimism that Remus could observe but never fully share. His exclusion from this renewal was absolute, marking him as someone whose condition made him unfit for the new society that was emerging from the ashes of war. The children who grew up during these years of peace knew nothing of the prices that had been paid for their security, the friends who had been lost, and the families destroyed in service of causes they could never fully appreciate. Their innocence was precious and deserved protection, but it also emphasized his own permanent exile from the normal experiences that they would take for granted throughout their lives. The magical innovations that transformed wizard society during the post-war years passed him by entirely, his poverty and isolation preventing him from participating in advances that might have made his condition more manageable or his life more bearable. Progress belonged to those who could afford it and had social connections to access it, qualifications that his circumstances made impossible to achieve. The hope that had once sustained him through the darkest periods of his life was gradually replaced by a form of resigned acceptance that acknowledged reality without embracing despair entirely. He would continue to exist because ending his existence would dishonor the memory of those who had loved him, but he would do so without expecting improvement or believing in possibilities for redemption that experience had taught him were illusions. The man who had once been the moral center of a group of friends whose adventures became the stuff of legend was slowly becoming a cautionary tale about the costs of difference in a world that valued conformity above compassion, tolerance above understanding. The transformation was as complete and irreversible as the monthly changes that marked his calendar, turning someone who had once embodied hope into a living reminder of how cruel fate could be to those who had committed no sin greater than being born different. But even in the depths of his isolation and despair, something essential remained unchanged about Remus Lupin's fundamental character. The kindness that had made him beloved among friends, the intelligence that had earned their respect, the courage that had brought him through childhood trauma. All of these qualities persisted beneath the accumulated weight of years of disappointment and social rejection, waiting for circumstances that might allow them to flourish once again. The letter that would eventually arrive from Albus Dumbledore lay years in the future, carrying with it the possibility of redemption and renewed purpose that seemed impossible from his current perspective. But the man who would receive that invitation and accept the challenge it represented was being forged in the crucible of solitude and suffering, tempered by experiences that would make him uniquely qualified to understand and help others who felt themselves abandoned by a world that had no place for what they had become. The letter that arrived at Remus Lupin's shabby cottage on a rain-soaked morning in late August carried the distinctive cream parchment and emerald green ink that had once been as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, though he had not seen such correspondence for over a decade. His hands trembled as he broke the wax seal bearing the Hogwarts crest, not from physical weakness, but from the shock of receiving communication from a world he had thought permanently closed to him, a realm of warmth and belonging that existed now only in memories too painful to revisit regularly. Albus Dumbledore's elegant script flowed across the page with the same graceful authority that had characterized all his communications during Remus's school years, but the content was so unexpected that he found himself reading each sentence multiple times to ensure that exhaustion and isolation had not caused him to hallucinate possibilities that could not exist in the harsh reality of his current circumstances. The headmaster was offering him a position at Hogwarts, not as a student seeking sanctuary, but as a professor charged with educating the next generation of witches and wizards. The defense against the dark arts post had been vacant since Gilderoy Lockhart's disgrace the previous year, and Dumbledore's letter made it clear that he was seeking someone whose practical experience with dark magic extended far beyond academic theory or manufactured adventure stories. The position would provide not only employment and housing, but access to Severus Snape's expertise in brewing wolfsbane potion, the miraculous draught that could transform his monthly ordeal from savage nightmare into manageable inconvenience. The offer seemed too generous to be real, too perfectly calibrated to address his every need and desire to represent anything other than elaborate fantasy conjured by a mind that had finally succumbed to the pressures of prolonged isolation and disappointment. Yet, the parchment felt solid beneath his fingers. The ink bore the subtle magical signatures that marked authentic Hogwarts correspondence, and the specific details about salary and living arrangements possessed the mundane precision that characterized genuine offers rather than wishful thinking. But even as hope began to kindle in his chest for the first time in years, fear rose to meet it with equal intensity. The thought of returning to Hogwarts, of walking corridors that held so many memories of friendship and belonging, felt almost unbearably poignant after the wilderness years that had taught him to expect nothing from life beyond basic survival. The students he would teach would be the same age he had been when James and Sirius and Peter had first accepted him, and their innocent faces would serve as constant reminders of what he had lost and could never recover. More practically, the revelation of his condition would be inevitable, given the close quarters and constant observation that teaching required. The monthly absences that had cost him every other position he had attempted would be impossible to conceal from colleagues who shared meals and social spaces, while students with the curiosity and intelligence that Hogwarts attracted would surely notice patterns that pointed toward explanations he could never safely provide. The decision to accept, despite these overwhelming concerns, was made not through rational calculation, but through desperate need for purpose and connection that had been denied to him for so long that he had almost forgotten what they felt. Like the prospect of contributing something meaningful to the world, of using his hard-won knowledge of dark magic to protect young people from dangers they could not imagine, offered redemption for years of feeling useless and abandoned by a society that had no place for what he had become. The journey to Hogwarts on the 1st of September required preparations that felt like emerging from hibernation, a gradual process of rejoining the world after years of deliberate withdrawal from all but the most essential human interactions. His threadbare robes were mended, as well as his limited skills allowed. His few possessions packed into a battered trunk that had served him faithfully through a dozen relocations. His appearance groomed to suggest professional competence despite the obvious markers of poverty and isolation that no amount of preparation could entirely disguise. The decision to travel on the Hogwarts Express, rather than apparating directly to the school, was born partly from nostalgia for journeys that had once represented escape from isolation to community, but also from practical economy that made the train ticket a more affordable option than the magical transportation alternatives available to someone of his limited means. The irony of a professor traveling to his new position alongside the students he would soon teach was not lost on him, but it felt appropriate for someone whose return to the wizarding world was as much about beginning again as it was about taking up adult responsibilities. The compartment where he settled for the journey north was the same type of space where he had first met James and Sirius and Peter, though the boy who had made those friendships felt like someone from another lifetime, someone whose innocence and hope had been gradually worn away by years of experiences that no child should have been forced to endure. The man who now occupied the worn bench seat bore scars both visible and hidden that told the story of transformation from protected student to survivor of circumstances that had tested every limit of human endurance. Sleep came easily despite his excitement and anxiety about the position that awaited him, the exhaustion of constant vigilance and poor nutrition, creating a weariness that no amount of anticipation could overcome entirely. The dreams that visited him during the journey were a mixture of memory and possibility, scenes from his student years, blending with imagined futures, where he might find peace and purpose. In the castle that had once been his sanctuary from a world that feared and rejected what he represented. The intrusion of Dementors onto the train was his first indication that the wizarding world had changed in ways that went beyond the obvious markers of post-war recovery and renewal. The creature's presence on what should have been a routine school journey spoke of security concerns that exceeded normal precautions, while their behavior suggested they were hunting for someone specific rather than conducting random patrols for escaped prisoners or dangerous fugitives. The effect of Dementors on his psychological state was more severe than it might have been for others, as his history contained more than the usual share of trauma and despair for these creatures to amplify and exploit. The memories they drew to the surface were not just painful but specifically calculated to remind him of every moment when he had felt most isolated, most ashamed, most convinced that his existence was a burden that others would be better off without. But it was the sight of Harry Potter collapsing under the Dementor's influence that galvanized him into action, transforming personal anguish into protective fury that swept aside his own vulnerability in favor of defending someone who represented everything good and innocent in a world that seemed increasingly dominated by darkness. The Patronus that erupted from his wand was powered by memories of friendship and acceptance, drawing strength from experiences that predated the losses and disappointments that had shaped his adult years. Harry's unconscious form was so reminiscent of James that Remus felt his heart stop for a moment, the resemblance triggering recognition that went beyond mere physical similarity to encompass something essential about character and potential that connected father and son across the years that separated them. The boy who lay before him carried not just James's features, but something of his spirit, the same courage and loyalty that had made his father willing to die rather than abandon those he loved. The chocolate he offered as remedy for Dementor exposure was a practical response born from years of experience with magical ailments, but the gesture also represented his first act as Professor Lupin, his initial attempt to provide comfort and healing to students who would look to him for guidance and protection. The simple kindness of sharing food felt like a return to humanity after years of existing on the margins of society, a reminder that his knowledge and experience could serve purposes beyond mere survival. Harry's awakening was accompanied by questions that revealed both his natural curiosity and his ignorance of dangers that seemed to be targeting him specifically, though he lacked the context to understand why creatures associated with Azkaban prison would be seeking him with such determined intensity. The boy's resilience in the face of supernatural terror impressed Remus deeply, suggesting that James and Lily's sacrifice had created not just a famous survivor, but someone whose character was worthy of the legend that surrounded his name. The conversation that followed their shared ordeal was Remus's first opportunity in years to interact with someone who knew nothing of his condition or his history of disappointment and social rejection. Harry saw him simply as a helpful adult who had appeared at a moment of crisis, someone whose competence and kindness could be trusted without reservation. The normality of such interaction felt almost miraculous after a decade of conversations shadowed by suspicion and eventual disappointment. The arrival at Hogwarts was both triumphant return and painful reminder of everything that had changed since his student years. The castle's timeless beauty serving as backdrop for recognition of how much he had aged and suffered, while its walls remained unchanged. The great hall that welcomed new students looked exactly as it had during his own sorting ceremony, but he observed it now from the high table where professors sat in judgment, rather than from the Gryffindor table where friendship had transformed his life. His introduction to the school as the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor was met with reactions that ranged from polite applause to obvious skepticism. His shabby appearance and unknown reputation clearly failing to inspire confidence among students who had grown accustomed to teachers who looked more successful and established. But he had learned long ago that first impressions could be overcome through competence and dedication, that respect had to be earned rather than assumed based on external appearances or inherited authority. The staff meeting that followed the welcoming feast provided his first glimpse of the complex dynamics that governed Hogwarts operations, revealing tensions and alliances that would shape his experience as much as his interactions with students. Severus Snape's presence at the table was particularly significant, given their shared history and the crucial role the potions master would play in brewing the wolfsbane that made his employment possible. Snape's greeting was coolly professional but not openly hostile, suggesting that their schoolboy animosity had been tempered by adult recognition of mutual dependence and shared responsibilities. The man who had once been tormented by James and Sirius now held the key to Remus's ability to function in civilized society, an irony that was not lost on either of them, as they negotiated the terms of their necessary cooperation. The quarters that had been prepared for him were more comfortable than anything he had inhabited in years, equipped with all the amenities that permanent residents of the castle enjoyed, but furnished in a style that suggested Dumbledore's understanding of his financial limitations. The rooms felt simultaneously luxurious and modest, providing privacy and security while remaining connected to the broader community that he had rejoined after so many years of isolation. His first classes revealed both the extent of his students' ignorance about practical defense and their eagerness to learn from someone who obviously possessed real experience rather than merely academic knowledge. The third years, who comprised his first Gryffindor class, approached the subject with the mixture of excitement and trepidation that characterized their attitude toward all potentially dangerous activities, while their questions revealed gaps in their education that previous instructors had failed to address adequately. The lesson on boggarts that he designed for their introduction to his teaching methods was chosen deliberately for its personal significance, representing both his father's area of expertise and his own first encounter with the creatures that had brought his parents together in the Welsh forest so many years before. The irony of using his family's history as educational material was bittersweet, but it also felt like honoring their memory through service to the next generation of students who needed protection from similar dangers. Neville Longbottom's terror during the practical exercise awakened every protective instinct that Remus possessed, the boy's obvious vulnerability and lack of confidence triggering recognition of his own childhood fears and insecurities. The encouragement he offered came not from teaching manuals, but from personal understanding of what it meant to face dangers that seemed overwhelming while doubting one's own ability to survive the encounter. The transformation of Neville's boggart from Severus Snape into a figure dressed in his grandmother's clothes was exactly the kind of practical magic that Remus believed defense classes should emphasize, teaching students that fear could be overcome through knowledge, preparation, and the courage to find humor, even in dire circumstances. The laughter that filled the classroom as other students faced their own transformed fears felt like vindication of his teaching philosophy and proof that learning could be both effective and enjoyable. Harry's reaction to the lesson was particularly gratifying, revealing intellectual curiosity and natural talent that reminded Remus powerfully of both James and Lily during their school years. The boy's questions about magical theory demonstrated understanding that went beyond mere memorization to encompass genuine interest in the principles that governed defensive magic, while his practical applications suggested instinctive grasp of concepts that many students struggled to master. But it was during individual instruction that Remus discovered the true extent of Harry's burden, as their sessions on Patronus Charm revealed both the boy's extraordinary magical ability and the trauma that Dementor encounters inflicted upon him. The memories that the creatures forced Harry to relive were not the ordinary disappointments and embarrassments that affected most people, but echoes of genuine horror that would have broken lesser spirits entirely. The process of teaching Harry to produce a Patronus became as much about healing as instruction, requiring Remus to help his student find memories powerful enough to overcome the despair that Dementors generated, while avoiding questions about his own relationship to Harry's parents that would complicate their teacher-student dynamic. The progress Harry made was remarkable, demonstrating resilience and determination that proved worthy of his legendary reputation. Their sessions together also provided Remus with opportunities to observe Harry's character in ways that public interactions never could, revealing qualities that went far beyond mere celebrity to encompass the kind of moral courage and personal integrity that had made James and Lily willing to die for their principles. The boy was becoming worthy of his parents' sacrifice, developing into someone who might justify the prices that others had paid for his survival. The Marauder's map's return to his possession was perhaps the most emotionally complex moment of his entire first term, as the parchment that contained so many memories of friendship and adventure now served as evidence of how completely those relationships had been destroyed by war and betrayal. The magic that he and his friends had woven into the map still functioned perfectly, but the people who had created it were dead or imprisoned or forever changed by experiences that had tested every limit of loyalty and trust. Seeing Peter Pettigrew's name moving across the map's surface was like encountering a ghost, impossible to believe, but undeniable in its implications for everything he thought he knew about the events that had destroyed his world 13 years earlier. The revelation that Peter was alive while Sirius languished in Azkaban for crimes he hadn't committed forced Remus to confront the possibility that his understanding of the past was fundamentally flawed, built on assumptions that evidence now suggested were entirely wrong. The confrontation in the Shrieking Shack became a convergence of past and present that tested every belief Remus held about friendship, betrayal, and the nature of justice in a world where appearances could be deceiving and truth could remain hidden for years beneath layers of convenient lies. The reunion with Sirius was both joyful and agonizing, reconnecting him with a friend whose loyalty had never wavered, while forcing recognition of the years of suffering that false accusations had inflicted upon someone who deserved only gratitude for his sacrifice. Peter's presence in his rat form was a living reminder of how completely trusted friends could betray those who loved them, revealing capacities for deception and cruelty that no one who had known him as a student would have believed possible. The transformation back to human shape was almost more shocking than his survival, as the man who emerged bore little resemblance to the boy whose friendship had once seemed as natural and permanent as breathing itself. The truth about the night that James and Lily died emerged in fragments that reconstructed a narrative far more complex and painful than the simple story of heroism and betrayal that had satisfied public curiosity for over a decade. Peter's cowardice and selfishness had led him to become a spy for Voldemort, providing information that made the attack on his friends possible, while Sirius had spent years in prison paying for crimes committed by someone he had trusted completely. The decision to spare Peter's life was Harry's to make, but Remus found himself supporting mercy over revenge, despite every instinct that demanded blood payment for the destruction that Peter's betrayal had brought upon their circle. The boy's moral authority in matters concerning his parents' death was absolute, and his choice to pursue justice through proper channels rather than vigilante execution demonstrated wisdom beyond his years. But their plans for civilized resolution were destroyed by Remus's failure to take his Wolfsbane potion, an oversight that transformed him from protector into threat at the moment when his friends needed his support most desperately. The transformation that followed was perhaps the most horrific of his entire life, occurring in the presence of people he cared about and threatening lives that his human consciousness valued above his own survival. The wolf that he became was savage with frustration and confusion, denied the calming effects of wolfsbane, while surrounded by humans whose scent triggered every predatory instinct that his condition carried. Only Buckbeak's intervention prevented tragedy that would have destroyed what remained of his capacity for hope or connection, the hippogriff's attack driving him deep into the forbidden forest where he could do no harm to anyone except himself. The dawn that returned his human consciousness brought with it recognition of what his carelessness had cost, not just in terms of Peter's escape, but in the revelation of his condition to students who had trusted him with their safety and education. The secret that had governed every aspect of his adult life was now known to people whose reaction would determine whether he could remain at Hogwarts or would be forced to return to the isolation and poverty that had defined his existence before Dumbledore's intervention. Severus Snape's role in exposing his lycanthropy felt like inevitable justice for years of concealment and deception, the potions master's revelation serving both personal revenge and legitimate concern for student safety. The man who had brewed his wolfsbane faithfully despite their shared history had every right to ensure that the wizarding public understood the risks that his employment represented, while parents had legitimate concerns about their children's exposure to dangers that the school administration had deliberately concealed. The resignation letter that Remus composed the morning after the disastrous full moon was perhaps the most difficult document he had ever written, requiring him to abandon the position that had restored his sense of purpose and connection, while accepting responsibility for failures that had endangered the people he most wanted to protect. The words came slowly and painfully, each sentence another acknowledgement of dreams that were ending before they had truly begun. But even as he prepared to leave Hogwarts forever, Remus felt gratitude that overwhelmed regret for the brief period when he had been allowed to contribute something meaningful to the world beyond mere survival. The students he had taught would carry his lessons with them regardless of the circumstances that ended his tenure, while the knowledge he had shared might someday save lives in ways that would justify the risks his presence had represented. Harry's visit during his final preparations for departure was both blessing and torment, the boy's obvious distress at his leaving serving as reminder of the connections that resignation would sever, along with the professional relationships that had made his brief return to society possible. Their conversation was necessarily limited by considerations of appropriateness and emotional safety, but it carried undertones of affection and mutual respect that would persist long after their formal teacher-student relationship ended. The return of the Marauder's map was a symbolic gesture that acknowledged both the end of one chapter in its history and the beginning of another, passing the magical artifact from the generation that had created it to someone who might use it for purposes that its original makers would have approved. The map would serve Harry well in adventures yet to come, providing guidance and protection that Remus could no longer offer in person. The journey away from Hogwarts felt like exile from paradise, each mile taking him further from the place where he had briefly belonged to a community that valued his contributions despite the difficulties his condition created. The future that awaited him was uncertain, but certainly difficult, marked by return to the poverty and isolation that employment at the school had temporarily alleviated. But the man who left Hogwarts was different from the broken wanderer who had arrived 9 months earlier, strengthened by proof that he could still make positive contributions to the world and renewed by connections that would persist even when physical proximity became impossible. The teaching position had been brief, but its effects on his sense of self-worth and purpose would influence every decision he made for the remainder of his life. The war that was coming would soon provide opportunities for service that extended far beyond classroom instruction, chances to use his knowledge and experience in defense of values that his brief return to Hogwarts had reminded him were worth preserving at any cost. The professor who had been forced to resign in disgrace would soon become a soldier whose contributions to ultimate victory would justify every sacrifice that circumstances had demanded of him. The summer that preceded Lord Voldemort's public return was marked by a tension that permeated the wizarding world like smoke from distant fires, visible to those who knew how to read the signs, but dismissed by officials whose positions depended on maintaining facades of normalcy that grew more transparent with each passing day. For Remus Lupin, existing once again on society's margins after his forced resignation from Hogwarts, the gathering darkness felt both familiar and ominous, reminiscent of the atmosphere that had preceded the First War, but carrying new complexities that suggested their enemy had learned from his previous defeat. The cottage where he had taken refuge after leaving the castle was even more isolated than his previous accommodations, chosen specifically for its distance from communities that might be threatened by his monthly transformations, now that Wolfsbane potion was once again beyond his financial reach. The building itself was little more than a ruin held together by magic and stubborn refusal to collapse, but it provided shelter and solitude that allowed him to process the emotional aftermath of his brief return to purposeful life. The return to poverty was made more bitter by the memory of what he had temporarily possessed, the knowledge of how fulfilling teaching had been serving, as constant reminder of opportunities that would likely never come again. His reputation was now thoroughly compromised by public knowledge of his lycanthropy, ensuring that employment prospects would be even more limited than they had been before Dumbledore's intervention offered him sanctuary and purpose. But the isolation that might once have driven him to despair was now tempered by awareness that greater struggles were approaching, conflicts that would require every person of conscience to choose between comfortable neutrality and dangerous commitment to principles that transcended personal safety. The Order of the Phoenix would inevitably be reformed, and his skills as both wizard and werewolf would be valuable assets in the asymmetric warfare that Voldemort's return would surely bring. The official announcement that the Dark Lord had indeed returned came through Daily Prophet reports that buried the truth beneath layers of bureaucratic denial and character assassination, transforming Harry Potter from celebrated hero to dangerous delusional in the space of a single news cycle. The boy's courage in speaking truth that the Ministry preferred not to acknowledge reminded Remus powerfully of James during their school years. The same willingness to stand alone against authority when conscience demanded resistance to comfortable lies. Dumbledore's summons to reform the Order arrived within days of the Ministry's public dismissal of Harry's testimony. The familiar handwriting and Phoenix-delivered parchment carrying weight of authority that government proclamations could never match. The invitation to resume his role in the organization felt like redemption for the failures that had ended his teaching career, proof that his value extended beyond his ability to maintain perfect control over his condition. The headquarters at Grimmauld Place was perhaps the most grimly appropriate setting imaginable for an organization dedicated to fighting dark magic, its walls soaked in generations of pure blood prejudice and decorated with artifacts that represented everything the Order stood against. But Sirius Black's inheritance of his family's ancestral home provided secure meeting space that enemy agents would find difficult to penetrate or monitor, while the building's magical protections could be enhanced rather than created from scratch. The reunion with Sirius was both joyful and heartbreaking, reconnecting him with a friend whose loyalty had been vindicated by Peter's exposure, while confronting the toll that 12 years in Azkaban had exacted from someone whose spirit had once seemed unbreakable. The man who emerged from wrongful imprisonment bore scars that went beyond physical damage to encompass psychological wounds that might never fully heal, making him both more dangerous and more vulnerable than the boy Remus remembered from their school days. But it was the introduction to Nymphadora Tonks that would prove most significant for Remus's personal future, though he could not have anticipated the impact this young aura would have on his carefully constructed emotional defenses. Her presence at Order meetings was initially notable, primarily for the energy and irreverence she brought to discussions, that might otherwise have been dominated by the weight of approaching conflict and memories of previous losses. Tonks possessed a combination of professional competence and personal warmth that reminded him of the best qualities of both his former friends and students, her metamorphmagus abilities making her invaluable for reconnaissance and infiltration missions, while her natural humor provided relief from the grimness that characterized so much of their work. Her easy acceptance of his condition, when she inevitably learned the truth, felt like a gift he had not dared to expect. Normality offered without conditions or reservations that might have made it feel like charity rather than genuine friendship. The missions they shared during the Order's Reformation period revealed depths to her character that her casual demeanor might have concealed from superficial observation. Courage that went far beyond mere professional duty to encompass genuine commitment to protecting people who would never know her name or understand the prices she paid for their safety. Her willingness to risk herself for abstract principles impressed him deeply, demonstrating the kind of moral clarity that made heroism possible even when victory seemed impossible to achieve. But it was her gradual penetration of the emotional barriers he had constructed around his heart that proved most transformative. Her persistent friendliness, eventually evolving into something deeper and more dangerous than anything he had experienced since his school years. The love that grew between them was unlike the easy camaraderie he had shared with James and Sirius, carrying implications and possibilities that his self-imposed isolation had taught him to consider impossible for someone with his condition. The recognition of his feelings brought with it a familiar pattern of self-denial and withdrawal, the same protective mechanisms that had governed his interactions with everyone who might be endangered by association with a werewolf. His attempts to maintain distance were frustrated by Tonks's refusal to accept rejection without explanation, her insistence that his condition was irrelevant to her feelings, challenging every assumption he had built about his own worthiness for love and companionship. The conversation that finally forced acknowledgement of their mutual attraction occurred during a surveillance mission that required them to spend an entire night watching a suspected Death Eater safe house, their forced proximity making continued evasion impossible when she directly confronted his obvious attempts to avoid anything approaching intimacy. Her casual mention of Sirius's continued attractiveness, despite his ordeal in Azkaban, was clearly intended to provoke exactly the response it generated. His bitter acknowledgement that she had probably fallen for his old friend, revealing emotions he had tried desperately to conceal. Her angry response that he knew perfectly well who she had fallen for cut through his defensive pessimism like a blade, forcing recognition that his assumptions about her feelings were as wrong as his beliefs about his own unworthiness for love. The happiness that flooded through him at her confession was unlike anything he had experienced since his friend's acceptance of his lycanthropy during their school years. Validation that someone could see past his condition to the person beneath while understanding fully what association with him would entail. But the joy of mutual recognition was immediately overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility that love brought with it. Awareness that accepting her affection would expose her to dangers and prejudices that had shaped every aspect of his adult existence. The wizarding world's treatment of werewolves extended to their associates and family members, creating guilt by association that could destroy careers and social relationships with ruthless efficiency. His immediate retreat into noble self-sacrifice was motivated by love rather than fear, the desire to protect her from consequences she might not fully understand outweighing his desperate need for the companionship and acceptance she offered. The refusal to acknowledge his feelings was perhaps the cruelest kindness he could offer, denying them both happiness in service of what he believed to be her long-term welfare and security. Tonks's response to his rejection revealed the depth of her understanding and the strength of her commitment. Her recognition that his refusal was motivated by misguided nobility rather than lack of feeling, making his position even more difficult to maintain. Her wisdom in seeing through his protective lies was matched by her patience in waiting for him to overcome the fears that made love seem more dangerous than solitude. The pattern of avoidance that he established in response to her declaration became increasingly difficult to sustain, as order operations frequently paired them together for missions that required exactly the combination of skills and, quote, temperaments that made their partnership so effective. Their professional compatibility only highlighted the personal connection he was trying to deny, creating situations where suppressed feelings threatened to overwhelm the careful boundaries he had constructed. His volunteer work for the most dangerous assignments was motivated partly by genuine commitment to the Order's mission, but also by desperate need to avoid temptation that grew stronger with every interaction they shared. The possibility of death in service to the cause seemed preferable to the slow torture of loving someone he could not allow himself to have, making recklessness feel like the most honorable available option. The deterioration in Tonks's emotional state that resulted from his rejection was visible to everyone who worked with them regularly, her natural exuberance gradually fading as she struggled with confusion and hurt that she could not fully understand or address. Her conviction that he loved her, but was refusing to admit it out of mistaken nobility, made her situation even more painful, creating hope and despair in equal measure that wore at her strength and effectiveness. The Battle of the Department of Mysteries provided a terrible climax to the tensions that had been building throughout their association, forcing them to work together in life or death circumstances, while dealing with emotional complexities that combat situations left no time to address properly. The sight of Tonks fighting with desperate courage against enemies who would have killed her without hesitation crystallized his understanding of how much he had come to care for her welfare and happiness. But it was Sirius's death during that battle that shattered the careful emotional control he had maintained since learning of her feelings. The loss of his oldest friend, removing one of the key barriers that had kept him isolated from normal human connection. Watching Harry's grief at losing his godfather reminded him powerfully of his own losses and the prices that love extracted from everyone brave enough to risk caring about others. The aftermath of Sirius's death created new pressures within the Order, as leadership responsibilities fell to members who had been followers during the First War, while the psychological impact of losing such a prominent figure affected morale in ways that no tactical victory could compensate. Remus found himself thrust into positions of greater authority and visibility, his experience and steady temperament making him valuable for coordination and planning roles that brought increased contact with all Order members. His assignment to infiltrate werewolf communities represented both logical use of his condition and dangerous exposure to the very forces that had shaped his identity and worldview, requiring him to live among creatures who embodied society's worst fears about what he might become if his human nature ever failed to control his bestial impulses. The mission brought him face to face with Fenrir Greyback for the first time since his childhood attack, a confrontation that tested every limit of his self-control and commitment to civilized behavior. Greyback's presence among the werewolf packs was like poison in an already toxic environment, his influence spreading philosophies of violence and revenge that transformed lycanthropy from tragic condition into weapon of terrorism against the wizarding world that had created the circumstances for such hatred to flourish. The man who had destroyed Remus's childhood had become something far worse in the intervening years, a recruiter for darkness who used legitimate grievances to justify atrocities that served no purpose beyond satisfying his appetite for cruelty. The time spent among werewolves who had been driven beyond desperation into active rebellion against a society that had never offered them hope or acceptance provided insight into the systemic injustices that created enemies more effectively than any Death Eater propaganda could achieve. The conditions that these magical beings endured were genuinely horrific, making Voldemort's promises of power and revenge attractive to people who had been denied every other avenue for improving their circumstances. His return from the werewolf communities brought with it knowledge that was both tactically valuable and emotionally devastating, intelligence about enemy recruitment methods, and planned attacks balanced against recognition of how many of Voldemort's followers were motivated by legitimate grievances rather than pure evil. The moral complexities of fighting people whose anger was justified even when their methods were inexcusable created challenges that simple concepts of good and evil could not address adequately. The Christmas celebration at the Burrow provided temporary respite from the grimness of war and infiltration work, offering a glimpse of the normal family life that the Order's efforts were designed to protect and preserve. The warmth of the Weasley household was almost overwhelming after months of living among outcasts and criminals, serving as a reminder of what civilized society could offer when fear and prejudice were set aside in favor of acceptance and love. But even this sanctuary could not entirely shield him from the consequences of his continued rejection of Tonks's feelings. Her obvious unhappiness casting shadows over celebrations that should have brought joy to everyone present. Her parents' concern for their daughter's welfare was evident despite their attempts to maintain festive atmosphere, while other Order members clearly understood that personal conflicts were affecting professional relationships in ways that compromised operational effectiveness. The conversation with Arthur Weasley about Snape's loyalties revealed the broader trust issues that were undermining Order cohesion, with members questioning each other's commitments and motivations in ways that created vulnerability to enemy manipulation and infiltration. His defense of Severus was based more on faith in Dumbledore's judgment than personal conviction about the former Death Eater's rehabilitation, but maintaining organizational unity required public confidence, even when private doubts persisted. His continued avoidance of extended interaction with Tonks during the holiday gathering was obvious to everyone present, creating awkwardness that no amount of magical celebration could entirely overcome. The pain in her eyes when he made excuses to leave rooms she entered was almost unbearable, but his determination to protect her from association with his condition remained stronger than his desire for personal happiness. The resumption of Order duties after the holidays brought renewed urgency, as intelligence suggested that Voldemort's plans were accelerating towards some major operation that would test every defensive measure they had established. The increased frequency and intensity of Death Eater attacks created an atmosphere of constant crisis that left little time for personal concerns, though the emotional undercurrents continued to affect everyone involved in their resistance efforts. The mission that brought him face to face with both Greyback and Tonks at Hogwarts was perhaps the most emotionally complex operation of his entire Order career, combining professional duty with personal stakes that made objective judgment nearly impossible to maintain. The battle within the castle walls was fought not just against Death Eaters, but against his own impulses to prioritize Tonks's safety over mission requirements that demanded equal attention to all participants. Watching her fight with skill and determination that matched any professional aura filled him with pride that was tempered by terror at the risks she was accepting for causes that were noble but might not justify the prices they extracted from those brave enough to serve them. Her courage was beyond question, but courage alone was not sufficient protection against enemies whose magical abilities and willingness to use unforgivable curses gave them significant advantages over defenders who maintained ethical constraints. The news of Dumbledore's death struck the Order like a physical blow, removing their most experienced leader and strategic mind at precisely the moment when his guidance was most desperately needed. The grief that overwhelmed Remus at this loss was compounded by recognition that the headmaster's death removed one of the few people whose wisdom and authority had provided stability during the most chaotic periods of their compounded struggle. But it was Fleur Delacour's declaration of love for Bill Weasley, despite his mauling by Greyback, that finally broke through the barriers Remus had constructed around his own heart. Her passionate defense of their relationship providing a model for how love could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable to more cautious souls. Her courage in embracing someone whose condition society would condemn demonstrated possibilities that he had been too afraid to consider seriously. Tonks's public acknowledgement of her feelings in the aftermath of Bill's attack was both brave and desperate, a final attempt to break through his protective rejections by making their mutual attraction impossible to ignore or deny. Her declaration before witnesses who understood the implications created a situation where continued evasion would appear cruel rather than noble, forcing him to choose between honest acknowledgement of his feelings and complete rejection that would destroy any possibility of future relationship. The acceptance that finally emerged from him was reluctant but absolute. Recognition that his attempts to protect her through distance had caused more pain than the association he feared could ever inflict. The love he admitted feeling for her was tempered by continued anxiety about consequences that might follow, but it was also strengthened by understanding that some risks were worth taking when the alternative was loneliness that served no one's interests. The wedding that followed their mutual confession was deliberately small and private, conducted in the Scottish Highlands where witnesses were drawn from local magical communities that had no prior knowledge of either participants' background or circumstances. The ceremony itself was simple but profound, creating bonds that felt both fragile and eternal in their significance for two people who had learned to expect disappointment from life's most important moments. The happiness that marriage brought to both of them was shadowed by awareness that their union had been forged during wartime, when normal considerations of compatibility and practical planning had been overwhelmed by urgency and uncertainty about whether any future would be available for more deliberate courtship. The love they shared was genuine and deep, but it existed within context of conflict that made long-term planning seem both essential and potentially futile. The pregnancy that followed within weeks of their marriage was both blessing and source of new anxieties, evidence of love's creative power, combined with recognition of responsibilities that war made difficult to fulfill adequately. The prospect of bringing a child into a world dominated by violence and hatred challenged every assumption they had made about the wisdom of their union, creating joy that was inseparable from fear about what kind of future they were creating for their offspring. The knowledge that their child might inherit his condition cast shadows over what should have been unmitigated celebration. The possibility that love could create another being condemned to monthly transformation and social rejection, making him question decisions that had seemed brave when they affected only consenting adults. The genetics of lycanthropy were poorly understood, but the risk was significant enough to cause sleepless nights filled with guilt and terror about consequences he might have inflicted on an innocent soul. But even in the depths of his anxiety about fatherhood and its implications, Remus found strength in Tonks's unwavering confidence that their love was powerful enough to overcome any obstacles their child might face. Her faith in their ability to provide protection and acceptance regardless of circumstances served as anchor during moments when his fears threatened to overwhelm rational thought and careful planning. The approaching confrontation with Voldemort's forces created urgency around their personal happiness that made every moment together feel precious and possibly final, awareness that war might separate them permanently, adding intensity to experiences that peacetime couples could take for granted. The love they shared was deepened by recognition of its fragility, strengthened by understanding that some forms of happiness were worth any risk that preservation might require. The marriage that had brought such unexpected joy to Remus Lupin's life was shadowed from its very beginning by fears that extended far beyond the normal anxieties that accompanied wartime unions. Concerns rooted in intimate understanding of what lycanthropy could mean for future generations, and the moral complexities of bringing children into a world where such conditions carried stigma beyond anything mere prejudice could encompass. The cottage where they had established their first home together was protected by wards that spoke of hard-won experience with magical security, but no amount of defensive magic could shield them from the internal struggles that threatened to undermine the happiness they had found in each other's arms. Tonks's pregnancy had been confirmed within mere weeks of their wedding ceremony, the timing so swift that it seemed almost magical in its precision, as if their love had been so powerful that it demanded immediate physical expression through the creation of new life. The news had filled her with unmitigated joy that radiated from her transformed features like sunlight, her metamorphmagus abilities responding to her emotional state by enhancing every aspect of her appearance that spoke of vitality and maternal promise. But for Remus, the confirmation of impending fatherhood brought with it a complex mixture of elation and terror that kept him awake through nights when exhaustion should have claimed him completely. The prospect of holding his own child, of experiencing the love that his parents had shown him despite every difficulty his condition had created, filled him with wonder that felt almost too intense to be safely contained within his human frame. Yet beneath this joy lay fears so profound that acknowledging them fully threatened to overwhelm his capacity for rational thought. The genetics of lycanthropy remained one of the most poorly understood aspects of the condition, with conflicting theories about inheritance patterns that offered no certainty about whether their child would be born with the curse that had shaped every aspect of his adult existence. Some experts claimed that lycanthropy could not be transmitted to offspring conceived before transformation, while others argued that the magical nature of the condition made it unpredictable in ways that conventional biological inheritance could not explain. The possibility that their son or daughter might inherit his monthly agony was almost unbearable to contemplate. Yet he found himself obsessing over every piece of research he could locate, searching desperately for definitive answers that the magical medical community seemed unable or unwilling to provide. The idea that his love for Tonks might have condemned an innocent child to a lifetime of transformation and social rejection created guilt so profound that it threatened to poison the very happiness that had motivated their decision to marry. His behavior during the early months of Tonks's pregnancy reflected these internal struggles in ways that confused and hurt his wife, whose natural optimism and confidence in their future together was challenged by his obvious distress and increasing withdrawal from the intimacy that had characterized their courtship. The man who had finally learned to accept love was struggling with the implications of creating love in the form of new life, torn between desperate desire for fatherhood and terror that such desires were selfish beyond redemption. The missions that the Order assigned during this period became refuges from domestic anxieties that felt more overwhelming than any external threat, dangerous operations offering the kind of clear-cut challenges that his parenting fears made impossible to navigate with confidence. The irony was not lost on him that he felt more competent facing Death Eaters than contemplating diaper changes, more prepared for magical combat than for the responsibilities that would define his identity as a father. But it was during one particularly harrowing mission, when he had volunteered for reconnaissance work that required deep penetration into enemy territory, that the full implications of his behavior finally became clear to him. Crouched in a ruined building while Death Eater patrols searched for intruders, he found himself hoping that discovery and death might solve the moral complexities that fatherhood represented, that dying heroically in service to the cause might spare his child and wife from the burden of his continued existence. The recognition of these suicidal impulses shocked him into awareness of how completely fear had begun to overwhelm love, how his terror of passing on his condition had transformed the greatest blessing of his life into a source of shame and self-loathing that threatened to destroy everything he and Tonks had built together. The realization that he was considering abandoning his family before it was even complete forced him to confront the selfishness that masqueraded as noble sacrifice. The journey back to their cottage after that mission felt like traveling through moral territory that he had never mapped before, landscape where familiar landmarks of duty and honor provided no guidance for decisions that would affect people whose welfare mattered more to him than his own survival. The man who returned to Tonks was subtly different from the one who had left, his face bearing signs of internal struggle that no external enemy had placed there. Their conversation that night was perhaps the most honest communication they had shared since their wedding, his admission of fears and doubts, creating space for her own anxieties, while establishing foundation for the kind of partnership that could survive challenges far more severe than anything they had yet encountered. Her response combined understanding with firmness that refused to accept his self-condemnation, love that acknowledged his fears while rejecting the conclusions he had drawn from them. The possibility that their child might inherit lycanthropy was real and could not be dismissed through optimism or wishful thinking. But Tonks's perspective on this prospect differed fundamentally from his own catastrophic assumptions. She had known his condition from the beginning of their relationship and had seen how he had transformed potential curse into source of strength and empathy that made him uniquely valuable to everyone whose life he touched. If their child did inherit his lycanthropy, she argued, he or she would have advantages that Remus had never possessed. Parents who understood the condition completely, a magical community that was slowly becoming more accepting of difference, and most importantly, absolute certainty of love and support, regardless of what monthly transformations might bring. The child would never experience the isolation and shame that had defined his early years, never face the rejection and abandonment that had made his condition feel like punishment for sins he had never committed. But her most compelling argument was personal rather than theoretical, rooted in observation of how lycanthropy had shaped his character in ways that made him extraordinary rather than simply unfortunate. His empathy for the marginalized and suffering came directly from his own experiences with rejection and pain, while his determination to protect others reflected understanding of what it meant to need protection that few people ever developed so completely. The strength of her conviction gradually began to penetrate the barriers of self-doubt that had made him nearly paralyzed with anxiety about fatherhood, her vision of possibilities replacing his focus on problems with hope that felt tentative but genuine. The idea that their child might actually benefit from having a father who understood difference and difficulty began to seem plausible rather than merely wishful, a perspective that transformed his condition from liability into potential asset. The months that followed brought gradual acceptance that fatherhood would require courage of a different sort than he had ever needed before, bravery that consisted not of facing external enemies, but of embracing vulnerability and uncertainty that came with loving someone whose welfare would always matter more than his own comfort or safety. The protective instincts that had made him an effective Order member began to focus on domestic rather than military threats, concerns about nursery security replacing worries about mission planning. But even as his anxiety about inherited lycanthropy began to diminish, new fears emerged to take its place. Concerns about his ability to provide the kind of stable environment that children required for healthy development. His employment history was checkered with gaps and failures that reflected the difficulties his condition created for maintaining normal career progression, while his financial resources remained limited by years of poverty that had preceded his brief period of professional success. The practical aspects of preparing for parenthood forced him to confront realities that romantic love had allowed them to ignore during their courtship and early marriage. Questions about housing, education, and financial security that would become crucial once their child arrived. The cottage that had seemed adequate for two adults who spent most of their time on Order missions would need modifications to serve as family home for people whose priorities extended beyond mere survival. More troubling were the security implications of parenthood in the context of ongoing war against enemies who would certainly view his wife and child as valuable targets for leverage against Order operations. The protections that had been sufficient for protecting two adults who could defend themselves would need enhancement to secure people whose magical abilities were either developing or non-existent, creating challenges that required resources and expertise beyond what their limited means could easily provide. The Battle of the Seven Potters represented perhaps the most dangerous mission either of them had undertaken since learning of the pregnancy, an operation where the stakes extended far beyond their own survival to encompass the safety of the child Tonks was carrying. The complexity of the plan required both of them to accept roles that exposed them to enemy action, while maintaining awareness that any injury to her could affect two lives rather than just one. His pairing with George Weasley during the aerial battle that followed their departure from Privet Drive created responsibilities that went beyond simple partner protection to encompass obligation to return safely to a wife whose condition made his survival essential in ways that single men rarely experienced. The sight of Death Eaters, in numbers that exceeded their intelligence estimates, made clear that their mission had been compromised by information leaks that suggested betrayal within their own ranks. The curse that severed George's ear during their flight was intended for him, deflected by Severus Snape's intervention in ways that he would not understand until much later, when the full complexity of the potions master's divided loyalties became apparent. The injury that George sustained was horrific, but survivable, requiring immediate medical attention that tested Remus's ability to maintain flight control while providing first aid to someone whose blood loss threatened to make him unmanageable. The arrival at the burrow with George unconscious and badly wounded felt like failure despite the technical success of their mission, proof that enemy capabilities exceeded their defensive preparations in ways that boded ill for future operations. The sight of Molly Weasley's face when she saw her son's condition was almost as painful as George's injury itself, stark reminder of how war affected families, whose only crime was loving people brave enough to fight against forces that threatened everything civilized society represented. The interrogation that followed their return was necessary, but felt like violation after the trauma of combat and near-death experience. Questions designed to verify identity and detect possible infiltration, creating atmosphere of suspicion that war had made routine, but no less painful. The fact that such precautions were essential spoke eloquently of how completely trust had been eroded by enemy action, and the growing certainty that their organization had been penetrated at the highest levels. His questions to Harry about their first meeting in his office were motivated by security protocols that seemed absurd when applied to someone whose identity was beyond question. But recent events had demonstrated that even the most obvious truths could be manipulated by enemies whose sophistication exceeded anything they had previously encountered. The correct answers that Harry provided were relief, but also reminder of how much had changed since that first defense against the dark arts lesson that had begun his teaching career. The discussion of Severus Snape's role in the battle revealed divisions within their ranks that went far deeper than simple disagreements about tactics or strategy, fundamental questions about loyalty and trustworthiness that threatened to paralyze decision-making when unity was most essential. His own defense of Snape was based more on faith in Dumbledore's judgment than personal conviction about the man's rehabilitation. But maintaining organizational cohesion required public support even when private doubts persisted. The late arrival of Tonks at the burrow created moments of terror that reminded him powerfully of what he had to lose if their resistance efforts extracted ultimate prices from those who served the cause. Anxiety that only began to subside when he could hold her in his arms and confirm that both she and their unborn child had survived the night's dangers without permanent harm. The relief that flooded through him at her safety was so intense that it revealed the full extent of fear he had been suppressing throughout the mission. The news of Mad-Eye Moody's death struck the assembled Order members like a physical blow, removing one of their most experienced and capable fighters, while demonstrating that even legendary competence was no guarantee of survival when facing enemies who possessed superior numbers and fewer moral constraints. The loss was both tactical disaster and emotional trauma for people who had learned to depend on Moody's expertise and uncompromising dedication to their cause. But for Tonks, Moody's death carried special significance that went beyond simple professional grief, as the grizzled Aurore had served as her mentor and protector during her early career, providing guidance and support that had been essential for her development into the formidable witch she had become. The tears she shed for his loss were those of someone saying goodbye to a surrogate father whose influence had shaped her understanding of duty and courage in ways that would persist throughout her life. The discussion of betrayal that dominated their post-mission analysis revealed how completely paranoia had begun to affect their operational effectiveness, suspicions about possible traitors within their ranks, creating atmosphere where every setback was viewed as potential evidence of treachery rather than simple misfortune or enemy competence. The corrosive effects of such attitudes threatened to destroy the trust that effective collaboration required, making them vulnerable in ways that went beyond mere tactical disadvantage. Harry's passionate defense of everyone who had participated in the mission provided voice for loyalty and faith that the older members had begun to lose, his youth and idealism, serving as reminder of principles that experience had taught them to question. The wisdom in his refusal to accept that betrayal was the only possible explanation for their difficulties, spoke to moral clarity that war had not yet corrupted, perspective that they needed to maintain if their cause was to remain worth the prices they were paying for it. The summer that followed brought renewed focus on domestic preparation as Tonks's pregnancy advanced toward its inevitable conclusion. Medical consultations and nursery arrangements, creating new routines that felt simultaneously normal and surreal, given the wartime context that surrounded their personal happiness. The transformation of their cottage into family home required modifications that went beyond simple decoration to encompass security enhancements that would protect occupants too young to defend themselves. But it was the psychological preparation for fatherhood that proved most challenging, requiring him to confront expectations and fears that had no basis in direct experience but were shaped by imagination that tended toward worst-case scenarios. When contemplating possibilities he had never dared to dream might become reality, the prospect of holding his own child, of being responsible for someone whose entire future would be influenced by his decisions and example, felt overwhelming in ways that facing Death Eaters had never approached. The wedding of Bill Weasley and Fleur Delacour provided temporary respite from war-related anxieties, while offering glimpse of the kind of celebration that peacetime might eventually allow. Ceremony that acknowledged both love's persistence and the uncertainty that made every commitment feel both precious and potentially tragic. Their attendance as expectant parents added layers of meaning to vows about supporting each other through whatever challenges the future might bring. But even this joyous occasion was interrupted by news that the Ministry had fallen to Voldemort's influence, transforming celebration into emergency evacuation as Death Eaters appeared at the reception with orders to capture or kill anyone associated with resistance activities. The battle that erupted among the wedding decorations served as stark reminder that no sanctuary was permanent when facing enemies whose reach extended throughout wizarding society. The escape from the wedding venue required split-second decisions about priorities and risks, choices between standing and fighting versus preserving lives that might be more valuable in future conflicts than in immediate combat. The sight of Tonks preparing to duel while heavily pregnant crystallized his understanding of how completely war had transformed normal life, making civilians into combatants, regardless of their personal preferences or physical limitations. The weeks that followed brought accelerated isolation as the new ministry regime began systematic persecution of anyone suspected of opposing Voldemort's authority, making public appearances dangerous for Order members whose identities had been compromised by previous activities. Their cottage became true fortress, protected by wards that made it virtually invisible to external observation while cutting them off from the broader magical community almost completely. The enforced domesticity of this period should have been idyllic preparation for parenthood. Quiet months when they could focus on each other and their approaching child, without external distractions or professional obligations. Instead, the isolation felt oppressive in ways that reminded him of his childhood, years of hiding from communities that might discover his condition, confinement that was protective, but also imprisoning. The psychological pressure of waiting for their child's birth while surrounded by evidence of their world's collapse began to affect both of them in ways that love alone could not address, creating tensions that reflected broader anxieties about bringing new life into circumstances that seemed to grow more desperate with each passing day. The news that filtered through their limited communication channels told of arrests, disappearances, and systematic destruction of everything they had fought to preserve. But it was his growing obsession with the possibility that their child might inherit his lycanthropy that created the most serious strain on their marriage, fears that had seemed manageable during pregnancy's early stages, becoming overwhelming as birth approached and theoretical concerns threatened to become concrete realities. The medical uncertainty about inheritance patterns meant that they would not know their child's status until after the first full moon, creating months of anxious observation that would test every assumption about their readiness for parenthood. The guilt that accompanied these fears was almost unbearable. Recognition that his love for Tonks might have condemned an innocent child to a lifetime of monthly agony and social rejection, making him question every decision that had led to their current circumstances. The rational understanding that lycanthropy was not automatically doomed for someone born into loving family could not entirely overcome emotional conviction that he was responsible for potentially inflicting terrible suffering on someone who had never chosen to exist. His behavior during this period reflected internal struggles that he could not fully articulate even to himself. Withdrawal from intimacy and communication that confused and hurt Tonks while serving no constructive purpose beyond allowing him to wallow in guilt that served neither of them. The man who had learned to accept love was struggling with the implications of creating love through procreation, torn between desperate desire for fatherhood and terror that such desires represented ultimate selfishness. The decision to flee their cottage and seek out Harry Potter was motivated by desperation rather than rational planning, impulse to escape domestic pressures that felt more overwhelming than any external threat, through immersion in the kind of heroic action that had defined his identity since joining the Order. The rationalization that he could better serve the cause by abandoning his pregnant wife to join a dangerous quest spoke to psychological breakdown rather than strategic thinking. His arrival at Grimmauld Place, where Harry was hiding, felt like return to familiar territory, where his value was measured by magical ability and tactical knowledge, rather than potential as husband and father, roles that he understood completely versus domestic responsibilities that terrified him beyond rational explanation. The offer to accompany Harry on whatever mission awaited represented escape from anxieties that no amount of courage seemed adequate to address. But Harry's response to his offer was unlike anything he had expected. The 17-year-old boy, demonstrating wisdom and moral clarity that surpassed his own despite decades of additional life experience. The harsh words about cowardice and irresponsibility cut through his self-justifying rationalizations like blades, forcing recognition of how completely fear had overwhelmed love in ways that dishonored everything he claimed to value. The comparison to James Potter was perhaps the most devastating aspect of Harry's condemnation, invoking memory of his friend's unwavering commitment to family and principle, even when such dedication meant accepting death rather than abandoning those who depended on him. The suggestion that James would be ashamed of his behavior struck at the core of his identity as someone who had tried throughout his adult life to honor the memory of friends whose courage had exceeded his own. The physical violence that erupted between them was shocking in its intensity, proof of how much pain his abandonment had caused, while demonstrating that even someone as gentle as Harry could be driven to rage by witnessing cowardice masquerading as noble sacrifice. The slam against the wall was less painful than the recognition that he deserved every harsh word that had been directed toward his character and choices. The solitary drinking that followed his expulsion from Grimmauld Place provided temporary escape from self-awareness that had become unbearable. Alcohol, offering the kind of oblivion that magical solutions could not provide for problems that were fundamentally moral rather than practical. The hours spent in the leaky cauldron's darkest corners were a form of penance that served no constructive purpose beyond allowing him to experience appropriate shame for behavior that had been inexcusable, regardless of the fears that motivated it. But even in the depths of his self-loathing, the essential lessons that Harry had tried to teach him gradually penetrated the barriers of defensive rationalization and self-pity. Recognition that love required courage to embrace vulnerability rather than wisdom to avoid potential pain. The example of his own parents, who had sacrificed peace and security to keep their family together, despite knowing the difficulties his condition would create, provided model for the kind of commitment that circumstances demanded. The journey back to Tonks felt like traveling through moral landscape that he was seeing clearly for the first time since learning of her pregnancy, territory where familiar landmarks of duty and honor suddenly pointed toward domestic rather than military service. The man who approached their cottage was fundamentally changed from the one who had fled, prepared to accept whatever challenges fatherhood might bring rather than seeking escape through heroic death. The reconciliation that followed was perhaps the most important conversation of his adult life. Acknowledgement of failures and fears balanced against promises about future behavior that he was finally prepared to honor, regardless of personal cost. Tonks's forgiveness was more generous than he deserved, but also more complete than he had dared to hope. Love that acknowledged his weaknesses, while refusing to accept that such flaws made him unworthy of the family they had created together. The birth of Edward Remus Lupin, called Teddy from his first moments of life, was perhaps the most transformative experience of Remus's existence, proving that love could indeed create miracles that transcended every fear and limitation that circumstances seemed to impose. The child who emerged into the world bore no signs of lycanthropy, his normal humanity representing victory over genetics and proof that some gambles were worth taking regardless of risks involved. But even more significant than his son's freedom from inherited curses was the recognition that fatherhood brought capabilities and purposes that he had never imagined possible, transformation of identity that made him stronger rather than more vulnerable, more committed to survival rather than more accepting of heroic death. The man who had spent his adult life believing himself unworthy of love discovered that creating love made him worthy of everything life had to offer. The request that Harry serve as Teddy's godfather was acknowledgement of debt that could never be fully repaid, gratitude for wisdom that had prevented him from destroying his family through cowardice that masqueraded as noble sacrifice. The boy who had taught him about courage would now share responsibility for protecting the child whose existence proved that love could overcome any obstacle when supported by sufficient determination and faith. The return to order service that followed Teddy's birth was motivated by love rather than duty, understanding that his son's future depended on victory over forces that would eliminate every form of difference and independence from magical society. The man who fought in the final battle would do so not as someone seeking heroic redemption, but as father determined to create a world where his child could grow up free from the prejudices and limitations that had defined his own existence. The final battle for Hogwarts began not with fanfare or formal declarations, but with the quiet certainty that came to those who understood that some fights could not be avoided, only faced with whatever courage and preparation time had allowed them to accumulate. For Remus Lupin, walking through the grounds of the school that had given him his first taste of belonging felt like completing a circle that had begun with his arrival as an 11-year-old boy, desperate for acceptance and friendship, though the man who returned bore scars and wisdom that no amount of academic instruction could have provided. The castle itself seemed to pulse with anticipation and dread in equal measure, its ancient stones having witnessed countless conflicts, but never one whose outcome would determine whether magical civilization would survive in any form that previous generations would recognize. The corridors that had once echoed with student laughter now hummed with the preparations of war, as teachers who had once worried about examination schedules transformed their classrooms into strategic positions and their educational supplies into instruments of defense. Tonks had insisted on fighting beside him despite his desperate attempts to convince her that their infant son needed at least one parent to survive the coming battle. Her fierce determination to protect the world where Teddy would grow up overriding every practical argument about the wisdom of leaving their child orphaned for the sake of principles that might not survive their martyrdom. Her presence on the battlefield represented both his greatest strength and his most terrifying vulnerability, the knowledge that he fought not just for abstract causes, but for the woman whose love had transformed his understanding of what life could offer. The sight of Harry Potter walking toward the Forbidden Forest to face Voldemort alone was perhaps the most heart-wrenching moment in a night that would be filled with impossible choices and unbearable losses. The boy who had become the symbol of resistance, accepting sacrifice that no one should have been asked to make. The courage required for such surrender was beyond anything that battlefield heroics could encompass, representing the kind of moral strength that made victory possible, even when survival seemed impossible. But it was the reunion with James, Lily, and Sirius as spirits summoned by the resurrection stone that provided the most profound emotional experience of Remus's final night. The restoration of connections that death had severed, allowing him to experience once more the friendship that had defined his youth and shaped his understanding of loyalty and love. Their presence was both blessing and torment, proof that some bonds transcended physical existence while serving as a reminder of everything that war had cost and would continue to demand from those brave enough to resist tyranny. The conversation they shared as they walked with Harry toward his confrontation with destiny was unlike any communication the living could experience with the dead, words that carried weight of accumulated years and the urgency of final farewells. The assurance he offered about Teddy's future was both promise and prayer, commitment that others would provide the guidance and protection that his death might deny to his son, ensuring that love would persist even when those who created it could no longer offer it directly. The comfort they provided to Harry during his final moments was perhaps the most important service that any of them had ever rendered. Their combined presence, creating sanctuary of acceptance and understanding that made the ultimate sacrifice bearable for someone who deserved better from life than the role of willing victim that circumstances had forced upon him. The peace that settled over the boy as he faced his death was testament to the power of love to transform even the most terrible necessities into something approaching grace. The battle that erupted after Voldemort's apparent victory was fought with the desperate fury of people who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove, defenders whose cause had been validated by Harry's sacrifice, but whose immediate prospects remained grim enough to require every resource of courage and determination that they could summon from hearts that had already been stretched beyond normal limits by years of loss and disappointment. Remus's participation in this final confrontation was shaped by awareness that his fighting days were drawing to a close, not through any prophetic knowledge of approaching death, but through recognition that the accumulated toll of his condition and lifestyle had left him less capable than he had once been. The months of relative inactivity following Teddy's birth had weakened reflexes that had been honed through years of dangerous service, while the domestic happiness he had discovered made him more cautious about risking the life that now carried responsibilities extending far beyond his own survival. But caution was a luxury that the circumstances of battle could not accommodate. As Death Eaters pressed their attacks with the viciousness of people who understood that defeat would mean not just political failure, but personal destruction at the hands of a master whose tolerance for incompetence had been demonstrated through years of creative punishment for those who disappointed his expectations. The defenders found themselves fighting enemies who possessed nothing to lose and everything to gain from victory achieved at any cost. The duel that would claim his life began almost accidentally, the kind of chance encounter that characterized battles where organized strategy gave way to individual combat between opponents whose personal hatred had been refined through years of ideological conflict. Antonin Dolohov was among the most experienced and dangerous of Voldemort's followers, a wizard whose skill with dark magic was matched by appetite for cruelty that had made him notorious even among Death Eaters who were not known for their restraint or mercy. Their confrontation was brief but decisive. Two wizards whose magical abilities were roughly equivalent testing each other's limits under conditions where a single mistake would prove fatal for someone whose death would affect far more people than just the individual. Combatants. The curse that struck Remus down was precisely calculated to cause maximum damage while ensuring immediate death, Dolohov's expertise allowing him to choose techniques that would prevent any possibility of magical healing or last-minute intervention. But even as his body failed and consciousness began to fade, Remus felt not despair or regret, but something approaching satisfaction, understanding that his death was occurring in service to causes that justified every sacrifice and in protection of people whose welfare mattered more than his own survival. The knowledge that Tonks was fighting somewhere else in the castle created anguish that no amount of noble purpose could entirely overcome. But even this pain was tempered by faith that their love would somehow persist beyond the physical destruction that war demanded from its servants. The transition from life to whatever realm awaited beyond death was gentler than he had expected, consciousness dissolving gradually rather than being severed suddenly, allowing time for final thoughts about the son who would grow up without direct knowledge of his father, but surrounded by people who would ensure that love and wisdom were transmitted across the boundaries that mortality imposed. The peace that settled over him as breathing stopped was unlike anything he had experienced during his tormented existence, release from monthly transformations and daily vigilance that had defined every aspect of his adult life. Tonks's death occurred in another part of the castle, her final battle fought with the same fierce determination that had characterized every aspect of her personality, courage that burned brightly enough to illuminate even the darkest moments of a conflict that seemed to demand everything good and beautiful as sacrifice to forces that acknowledged no value except power and control. Her last thoughts were of the infant son they had created together, and the husband whose love had taught her that some things were worth dying to protect. The convergence of their deaths in service to the same cause represented both tragedy and triumph, loss that would deprive their child of direct parental guidance, while ensuring that he would inherit a world where such guidance could be safely provided by others who shared their values and commitments. The sacrifice they made together was not planned or coordinated, but grew naturally from shared understanding that some prices were worth paying when the alternative was surrender to forces that would destroy everything they had fought to create and preserve. The discovery of their bodies after Voldemort's final defeat was among the most painful aspects of a victory that had been purchased with blood that could never be replaced or forgotten. Proof that triumph often came at costs that made celebration feel almost sacrilegious when measured against what had been lost. The sight of two people who had found love despite every obstacle fate could devise lying still and cold among the other defenders created grief that no amount of strategic success could entirely overcome. But their deaths also served as inspiration for those who survived to build the kind of world that would justify such sacrifices. Motivation for creating society where differences were celebrated rather than feared, where conditions like lycanthropy would not condemn people to isolation and rejection, where children could grow up secure in the knowledge that love was stronger than prejudice and more persistent than hatred. The funeral that honored their memory was attended by hundreds of people whose lives they had touched through service and sacrifice, representatives of every segment of magical society who had benefited from their dedication to causes that transcended personal interest or safety. The eulogies delivered by colleagues and friends painted portraits of two individuals who had found in each other the courage to become more than either could have achieved alone. Harry Potter's role in raising Teddy Lupin represented perhaps the most meaningful form of memorial that could have been conceived, ensuring that their son would grow up, knowing not just that his parents had been heroes, but understanding the specific ways in which their heroism had been expressed through daily choices to serve others rather than themselves. The Godfather's influence would provide continuity between past and future, that death could interrupt but not entirely sever. The Order of Merlin, first class, awarded to Remus posthumously, was the first such honor ever bestowed upon a werewolf. Recognition that individual worth could transcend the accidents of biology or the prejudices of society when measured by standards that emphasized character over condition. The precedent established by his recognition would influence official attitudes toward magical beings for generations to come, gradually expanding definitions of citizenship and acceptance. More significantly, his example provided inspiration for others who struggled with conditions or circumstances that made them feel excluded from normal magical society, proof that limitations could be overcome through determination, and that love could indeed conquer fear when given opportunity to demonstrate its transformative power. The textbooks that would eventually include his story would emphasize not his lycanthropy, but his humanity, teaching future students that heroes came in forms that prejudice might not recognize immediately. The Wolfsbane potion research that was funded in his memory would eventually lead to improvements that made the treatment more affordable and accessible, ensuring that other werewolves would not have to endure the isolation and poverty that had characterized so much of his adult life. The foundation established by his friends and colleagues would continue his work of advocating for magical beings whose conditions made them vulnerable to discrimination and persecution. The cottage where he and Tonks had lived during their brief marriage became shrine to their memory that attracted visitors from throughout the magical world. People who came to pay respects to two individuals whose love story had transcended the boundaries that society typically imposed on those who were different or dangerous. The flowers that grew wild in their garden seemed to bloom more brilliantly than nature alone could account for, as if love had left permanent mark on the very soil where happiness had briefly flourished. But perhaps the most lasting memorial was the change in attitude toward lycanthropy and other magical conditions that his life and death helped to inspire. Gradual shift from fear and rejection toward understanding and acceptance that would benefit countless individuals whose only crime was being born different from the statistical norm. The ministry policies that evolved in the post-war period reflected recognition that diversity of magical conditions could be source of strength rather than weakness when properly understood and managed. The support groups for families affected by lycanthropy that formed in his memory provided resources and guidance that had never been available during his own childhood, ensuring that future generations would not have to endure the isolation and shame that had characterized his early years. The scholarship fund established in his name would help lycanthropic children receive the education they deserved, regardless of their family's financial circumstances or social status. The defense against the dark arts curriculum that was developed using his teaching methods would influence magical education for decades to come, emphasizing practical applications and moral considerations that academic instruction had traditionally ignored or minimized. His understanding that defense required not just magical skill, but emotional intelligence and ethical grounding would be transmitted to students who never met him, but benefited from wisdom earned through suffering and sacrifice. The annual memorial service held at Hogwarts became occasion for celebrating not just his individual contributions but the broader principles that his life had embodied. Recognition that heroism could be expressed through teaching and protection as well as through dramatic battlefield courage. The speeches delivered by colleagues and students emphasized the quiet forms of bravery that characterized his daily existence. Choices to continue serving others, despite personal costs that would have justified withdrawal from public life. Young witches and wizards who struggled with their own forms of difference found inspiration in stories about the professor who had transformed his greatest weakness into his most distinctive strength. Proof that conditions that seemed to preclude normal life could actually provide unique perspectives and capabilities that society needed desperately. The message that difference did not mean deficiency would be transmitted through generations of students who learned to see diversity as blessing rather than burden. The magical creatures who had been marginalized and persecuted under previous regimes found in his memory a symbol of possibility, evidence that acceptance and integration were achievable goals rather than impossible dreams. The legislation that expanded rights and protections for non-human magical beings was often referred to as the Lupin laws, recognition that his advocacy had created foundation for legal and social changes that would benefit millions of individuals. But beyond official recognition and institutional change, his greatest legacy lived in the individual hearts and minds that had been touched by his example, people who learned through his story that love was indeed the most powerful magic of all, capable of transforming curses into blessings and isolation into connection when applied with sufficient courage and persistence. The ripple effects of his influence would continue expanding long after his death, inspiring acts of kindness and acceptance that he would never know about, but would have treasured beyond any formal honor. The world that Teddy Lupin inherited was fundamentally different from the one that had nearly destroyed his father through prejudice and rejection. Society that had learned through painful experience that diversity was strength, and that the greatest threats came not from those who were different, but from those who sought to eliminate difference through force and fear. The boy who grew up knowing that his father had been a hero would also understand that heroism took many forms, not all of which involved dramatic gestures or public recognition. The love that had created him would persist in the stories told by those who remembered his parents, tales that emphasized not their tragic deaths but their triumphant lives, examples of how two people could find each other across every obstacle that fate could devise and create something beautiful and lasting, despite circumstances that seemed designed to prevent such happiness. The legacy of their love would be measured not in years of marriage, but in the depth of impact their relationship had on everyone who witnessed it. In the quiet moments of peace that followed Voldemort's defeat, when the wizarding world began the long process of healing and rebuilding, those who had known Remus Lupin would remember him, not as the werewolf who had struggled with his condition, but as the man who had taught them that acceptance was the foundation of all other virtues, that understanding could overcome fear, and that love was indeed powerful enough to transform the world when given opportunity to work its quiet magic on hearts that were ready to embrace possibility rather than limitation. The professor who had believed himself unworthy of happiness had discovered that worthiness was not prerequisite for love but consequence of it, transformation that occurred when people chose to see beyond surfaces to the essential humanity that connected all conscious beings, regardless of the forms their consciousness might take. His life had been testament to the power of second chances and the miracle of redemption through service to others, lessons that would continue teaching long after his voice had been silenced by death that was tragic in its timing, but triumphant in its meaning. The man who had spent his childhood hiding from the world had died protecting it. Evolution from fearful isolation to courageous sacrifice that represented the kind of transformation that made heroism possible for ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances. His story would be told and retold, not as cautionary tale about the costs of being different, but as inspiration for anyone who had ever felt excluded or unwanted, proof that individual worth was determined by choices rather than conditions, by love rather than luck, by what one gave to the world rather than what one received from it. Rest now, dear listener, as our tale of Remus Lupin finds its peaceful conclusion. In the gentle darkness of this quiet hour, let yourself be comforted by the memory of a man who proved that our worst trials can become our greatest strengths, that love can flourish even in the deepest darkness, and that kindness is the most powerful magic of all. Though Remus carried the burden of lycanthropy all his life, he never let it define his spirit or diminish his capacity for compassion. His story reminds us that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting with love despite our deepest terrors. From the frightened child hiding his condition, to the devoted teacher who saw potential in every struggling student, from the loyal friend who never abandoned hope to the father who chose love over fear, Remus Lupin's journey was one of constant transformation, not just under the full moon, but in every moment he chose connection over isolation. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the magical world, his son Teddy grows up surrounded by love, carrying forward his father's gentle strength and his mother's fierce loyalty. And in your dreams, may you find the wisdom of Professor Lupin, the courage to embrace what makes you different, and the peace that comes from understanding that we are all worthy of love, exactly as we are. Sweet dreams, and remember, even the darkest nights end with dawn.